Anime autopsy here, and I need you to stop telling me Zoro is Ryuma's reincarnation for 5 consecutive minutes so we can have an actual conversation about his bloodline. Because listen to me, the way this community talks about Zoro's origins right now is completely deranged. Every day I open Twitter and it's the same thing. Cropped panel of Zoro next to Ryuma, same scar, same pose, captioned Oda planned this from chapter 1. Then under that, a TikTok of someone zooming into Hiyori's reaction shot, slapping on reverb and declaring secret Wano prince confirmed. Then YouTube thumbnails with Zoro's eyes glowing neon, Ryuma's scar circled in red, and titles that might as well say, Breaking Zoro is God now. This is not analysis. This is the pattern-seeking monkey brain seeing Jesus in toast and calling it foreshadowing. And before you get defensive, this is not a sin. This is fine. This is normal fan behavior. The problem is when those vibes harden into facts and suddenly anyone who doesn't think Zoro is a reincarnated daimyo baby is ignoring the obvious. Here's the thing. The current discourse is obsessed with the label. Reincarnation. Secret prince. Chosen swordsman of destiny. Everyone wants to shove Zoro into a clean little storytelling category because it feels satisfying. It's easier to scream, he's Ryuma reborn, than to ask the much more uncomfortable question. Why did this author spend decades quietly wiring Zoro into Wano, the Shimotsuki clan, and Ryuma's legend without ever just saying the words on panel? We need to talk about that difference. Because right now, fans are treating every coincidence, every parallel, every shared silhouette, as if Oda walked into the SBS and said, yes, he's Ryuma's soul with a crown. He didn't. What he actually did was way more intentional and way more dangerous for the story than any reincarnation fanfic. Oda has already told us what Zoro is, not hinted, told. He confirmed that Shimotsuki Kozaburo left Wano 55 years ago, founded Shimotsuki village, and forged both Wado Ichimonji and Enma. He named Zoro's hometown after a Wano daimyo family. He built an entire thriller bark prototype where Zoro meets Ryuma's corpse, duels his own future legend, and walks away carrying that legacy on his hip. That is not random writing. That is planned heritage. And no, that doesn't make Zoro a random orphan either. It makes him something much scarier than a prince. A deliberate continuation of a bloodline that already broke the rules once and is now boomeranging back into Wano's endgame. I say this as someone who has spent an embarrassing amount of adult life cross-referencing SBS pages, Vivre cards, and publication dates instead of touching grass. The community's favourite answers? Mostly wrong. But the real answer? Way cooler, way more intentional, and it's been sitting in plain sight for decades. So in this video, I'm going to pull every Zoro hint from Chapter 1 to Wano, sort out what's genuine foreshadowing and what's retrofit fan fiction, and show you what Oda actually built. And once you see it, reincarnation theory is going to feel embarrassingly small. So yes, you clicked on a video that is, functionally, a 2-hour paternity test for a green-haired cartoon swordsman. This sounds insane. It sounds deranged. But listen to me. This is not actually about who is Zoro's dad. This is about how an author builds protagonists, legacies, and entire national myths through bloodlines. Here's the thing. When you zoom out, Zoro's family isn't trivia, it's infrastructure. It's how Oda stitches East Blue, Wano, and Ryuma's legend into one continuous story without ever standing on a soapbox and yelling, by the way, this guy is secretly important. The high-level thesis I'm arguing for is simple to state and annoying to prove. Zoro is almost certainly a Shimotsuki descendant by design. Not by accident, not by, oh that name sounds cool, by design. But that does not mean secret daimyo prince. It does not mean Ryuma reincarnation. It means Oda is using Zoro's bloodline as a narrative tool, a bridge. Shimotsuki village shares a name with a Wano clan. Shimotsuki Kozaburo leaves Wano 55 years ago, forges Wado Ichimonji and Enma, and founds the village where Zoro grows up. Thriller Bark hands Zoro Ryuma's body and sword as a prototype reveal. None of that turns Zoro into royalty. It turns him into the guy who can connect the nobody from East Blue fantasy to the god of the blade from Wano myth without breaking either. To get there without turning into the pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast every time Zoro swings a sword, we need structure. I need you to know exactly what this 2-hour autopsy is going to do. First, we're going to build a conceptual framework, foreshadowing, retrofitting, and what I'm calling pre-writing. Foreshadowing is the intentional seed. Retrofitting is the retroactive patch. Pre-writing is the terrifying category where the author already knows the endpoint and is just revealing the story out of order. Then we walk, chronologically, through Zoro's entire story. Shimotsuki village, Koshiro, Kuina, the dojo, the swords, Thriller Bark and Ryuma, Sabadi, Punk Hazard, Dressrosa, all the way to Wano and Enma. Every time the story nudges you toward, this guy feels Wano coded, we're going to stop, tag the panel, and drop it into a category. Real foreshadowing, clever retrofit, or pre-written scaffolding, Oda planted decades in advance. Why be this pedantic? Because if we don't define our terms, every scar, every glare, every old man in a kimono becomes proof of whatever theory you already like. This is fine if you're having fun on Twitter. This is a problem if you actually care about author intent and how long-form storytelling works. Without categories, the entire conversation is mush. By the end, you should be able to look at any Zoro Bloodline panel and say, with receipts, this is genuine foreshadowing, this is a retrofit, or this is part of Oda's long, weird pre-writing game. And once we have that toolkit, we can finally answer the real question, not just who Zoro is, but why Oda needed him to be a Shimotsuki in the first place. Which means next, we have to build that toolkit. And before we do, I need you to admit something with me. Our community has completely melted the word foreshadowing into useless sludge. Every time Zoro breathes in the same panel as a samurai, it's insane foreshadowing. Zoro's scar is vaguely where Ryuma's is. Foreshadowing. A shadowy swordsman silhouette in a cover spread? Foreshadowing. Some old guy says, "You remind me of..." And suddenly half the subreddit is drawing family trees in MS Paint. We've turned every visual rhyme, every coincidental pose, every "this sort of feels similar" moment into the same buzzword. And when everything is foreshadowing, nothing is. Here's the thing. Not all hints are the same species. We need categories. We're going to use 3 for this entire video. Real foreshadowing, retrofitting, and pre-writing. Once you start sorting Zoro panels into those boxes, a lot of the louder theories just evaporate on contact. So, definition time. Foreshadowing in the classical sense is when an author intentionally plants information early that they already know will pay off later. The key word there is intentionally. The setup is written because the payoff is already in the author's head. Chekhov's gun is on the mantle because someone is going to fire it in Act 3, not because, maybe I'll use a gun someday. If Oda draws a kid in Shimotsuki village holding Wado Ichimonji while already knowing this sword was forged by a guy from Wano and will connect to Enma, that's foreshadowing. Retrofitting is different. Retrofitting is when the author goes back, looks at something they wrote without a specific plan, and later assigns new meaning. This is not a sin. This is fine. This is normal. Most long-running series survive on this. You introduce a random samurai silhouette early because it's cool, and 10 years later you go, oh, that could be a Shimotsuki ancestor actually, and you write around it. The meaning is real in the final text, but it wasn't planned at the moment of creation. And then there's pre-writing. Pre-writing is the scaffolding. Oda knowing there is a country of samurai. It is called Wano. There is a clan named Shimotsuki. One of my main characters comes from their offshoot village. Before chapter 1 ever drops. He doesn't have every panel planned, every scar position nailed down, every bloodline chart laminated on the wall. He has a flexible blueprint. The story we're reading is him slowly revealing pieces of a decision that already exists. Except reality is messy. Weekly manga is a war of attrition. Plans change, editors interfere, popularity polls bully side characters into relevance. Even a monster planner still has to improvise around sick weeks, cancelled arcs, and 25 years of shifting interests. The idea that Oda had Zoro is absolutely X's reincarnation with this exact scar and this exact genealogy locked on day 1 is fantasy. So listen to me. When we judge Zoro theories, we're going to be ruthless. If a supposed clue only works as a retrofit, it goes in that box. If it depends on Oda being an omniscient god of spreadsheets, it probably dies. And the fun part? What survives that process, the Shimotsuki evidence that still stands under a strict foreshadowing definition, becomes 10 times more terrifying. Next, we're going to start using this toolkit on Zoro's actual life, from Shimotsuki village to Wano, and figure out which panels were planned, which were patched, and which were pre-written time bombs waiting to go off. So before we start pinning red strings between every panel from Shimotsuki village to Wano, we need to do something deeply unsexy. We need to talk about labor, about what it actually means to produce a weekly manga for 25 years while millions of fans scream, "This was foreshadowed from chapter 3 at your face." Here's the thing. A standard chapter is around 15 to 20 pages. Every single week. That means rough storyboards, then cleaner name drafts, then final pencils, then inks, tones, corrections, all while you're in meetings with your editor arguing about which gag to cut so you can fit one more Zoro panel. In parallel, you're designing islands, powers, ships, outfits, entire cultures, and oh yeah, trying to remember what colour someone's hair was in an SBS from 2004. Now stack on the external pressure. Editors are not passive lore archivists, they are traffic cops with sales data. If Zoro polls well in reader surveys, the editor is going to push for more Zoro. If a mystery spikes engagement, the magazine wants that mystery extended or paid off or escalated into a big twist right when circulation dips. You're not a solitary author in a cabin. You're a content factory inside a weekly magazine war. So when fans in the community talk about perfect long-term bloodline planning, I need you to hear how insane that sounds in context. You're juggling hundreds of characters, dozens of islands, multiple power systems, 10 different categories of mystery, all on a schedule that would make a normal person fold into dust. Not having a complete Zoro family tree, with every ancestor and sword lineage nailed down in chapter 3. This is normal. Retrofitting under these conditions is not a sin. This is fine. This is survival. You leave certain details fuzzy on purpose because you don't know yet whether that one village name or that one sword is going to become crucial or stay a fun background detail that 3 people on Reddit care about. Take who are Zoro's parents as an example. That is a side mystery, a flavor question. In pure industrial storytelling logic, that's the exact kind of thing you keep open so you can weaponize it later when the story needs emotional fuel. Or when the editor says, "Hey Wano arc, maybe now is a good time to cash in the samurai guy's backstory." And this is where Oda is different. Listen to me. He's not sitting there with a 500-page Zoro genealogy scroll from day 1. What he does instead is plant modular pieces. Shimotsuki village, Wado Ichimonji, a swordsman from a country of samurai. He locks those in early, then waits. Years later, when Wano and Ryuma step onto the stage, he decides how those pre-existing pieces snap together. So, to even answer that Ryuma question, we need to get really boring for a second. We need to pin down what real foreshadowing actually is, in a strict, no copium, no headcanon sense. Because if we don't, every cloud that vaguely resembles a sword becomes Zoro-confirmed celestial dragon. Here's the thing. Foreshadowing is not, this detail exists, and later, the author found a cool way to use it. That's retrofitting. That's fine. That's normal. Real foreshadowing is when a setup exists because the author already knows the payoff and is deliberately preparing you for it. Cause and effect. Decision first, hint second. The gun is on the mantle because the shooting scene is already in the outline, not because the author might someday want to write a gunfight. Let me give you a clean narrative example. In Act 1, you see a kid nervously practicing a very specific sword style. Not just he trains, but a named form with a weird stance, a quirk that stands out, something the camera lingers on. In Act 3, the villain's technique is only countered by that exact form, not a random slash, not swordsmanship in general. That one style. That is planned, intentional, and thematically aligned. The hero's insecurity in Act 1 becomes the key to saving everyone in Act 3. Now compare that to, oh, the kid used a sword once, so obviously the author planned for him to kill God with a sword 15 years later. No. That's our pattern-seeking monkey brain seeing Jesus in toast. The difference is specificity and necessity. The story needed that exact setup to pay off that exact moment. So, bring this to Oda. When Shanks puts the straw hat on Luffy's head, gives him a promise, and the narrative brands that hat as a symbol of inherited will, everyone agrees that's foreshadowing. Why? Because the entire story's long-term goal, Grand Line, Pirate King, return this hat to me when you've made it, is baked into that scene. It's not a random accessory. It's a loaded gun that keeps firing for 1,000 chapters. Same with early mentions of the Grand Line, Raftel, the Pirate King. Those aren't background trivia. They define the trajectory of the plot. You remove them, the spine of One Piece collapses. That's our working standard. So I need you to lock in these criteria, because we're going to use them as a legal test later. A setup has to be specific, narratively relevant at the time, and not easily replaceable by any other detail. It should feel, in hindsight, less oh neat coincidence, and more, of course, this was here. The story literally needed this to function. A loaded gun, not a random vase on the shelf. And when we apply that to Zoro, when we start stress testing Shimotsuki Village's name, Wado Ichimonji's origin, and the way Ryuma is introduced, some of those details start to wobble out of the coincidence category and slide into Oda quietly loading a blade-shaped gun decades early. Listen to me. Once you see which pieces are too specific, too necessary to be accidents, Zoro's bloodline stops being a mystery and starts being an answer Oda has been daring you to say out loud. Next, we're going to start pulling that trigger. So before we start firing that gun, we need to talk about something the community treats as a war crime. Retrofitting. I need you to unclench your shoulders for a second, because this word has been living rent-free in people's heads as proof the author had no plan. That's just wrong. Here's the thing. Retrofitting is a very specific category. It's when an author takes an old element that originally had a loose, vague, or totally different purpose, and later assigns it a sharper, deeper meaning to serve a new plot or character direction. You wrote mysterious scarred swordsman as a cool visual. Years later, you decide that Scar is from a duel with the hero's dad, and suddenly it's lore. That's a retrofit. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is, in fact, how most long-running storytelling survives past Volume 3 without collapsing under its own continuity. In a weekly manga that's been running for decades, you cannot pre-plan every eyebrow hair. You plant flexible pieces, and then you decide which ones to promote into capital P plot when you get there. This is fine. This is normal. The quality test is simple. Good retrofitting feels organic because the earlier element was already compatible with the new meaning. It doesn't have to be intentional foreshadowing. It just has to fit the existing tone, theme, and facts. When Skypia's mantra got formalized as haki, it slotted in cleanly because the behavior was already there. Bad retrofitting, on the other hand, breaks the toy. It contradicts what we were shown, or it asks you to ignore clear information so the author can pull a twist they never earned. Fans, understandably, hate that second category, so we overcorrect. We want the comfort of the 4D chess author who planned every panel 20 years in advance. We want to believe every background silhouette is a secret yonko. And because our brains are pattern-seeking monkeys who see Jesus in toast, we start calling any satisfying connection foreshadowing, even when it's clearly a retrofit or just good improvisation. The problem is, when you do that, you erase a different kind of craft. The skill of looking back at your own mess and weaving a cleaner, richer pattern through it without snapping anything. Listen to me. Authors need that freedom, especially someone operating on Oda's timescale. He has a pre-written endgame, yes, but inside that skeleton he is constantly retrofitting details to heighten payoffs, which brings us back to Zoro. When Wano suddenly starts treating him as Ryuma's mirror, when everyone stares at his face, scar and sword style and goes, huh, that is not all pristine day one foreshadowing. Thriller Bark gave Oda a prototype, Zoro, dragon slaying in a country of samurai, crossing paths with Ryuma's corpse. Years later, he retrofits that resonance into something sharper by anchoring Zoro to the Shimotsuki name, to Enma, to Kozaburo, leaving Wano and founding Shimotsuki village. Does that make it cheaper? No, it makes it smarter. The emotional truth still lands. Zoro isn't random muscle. He's the modern answer to an old Wano legend. Next, we're going to sort which parts of that connection were pre-written blades and which parts were retrofitted handles Oda screwed on later. So before your brain goes, okay, but Oda is a genius, Zoro was planned from the womb, we need to walk over to a safer battlefield. Naruto, specifically Tobi. Remember Tobi? The masked idiot doing fortnight dances in the Akatsuki cloak who somehow turns into one of the main villains and the emotional core of Kakashi's entire backstory. Because the Naruto community does the exact same thing we do. They point at that reveal and go, Kishimoto planned this 500 chapters ago. Insane foreshadowing. And on the surface, it feels true, right? Tobi has the same spiky hair silhouette as Obito. He's missing an eye. He makes these vague little comments about the past, about those who abandon comrades, about the tragedy of the ninja world. You get panels where Tobi standing over Naruto visually mirrors Obito under the rocks. It all lines up so cleanly, you start feeling like a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast. Except, here's the thing. Once you step outside the panels and look at production, the story gets messier. Kishimoto has said in interviews that Tobi's identity shifted during planning. At one point, Tobi was going to be Madara for real. At another, he was more of a generic masked mastermind. The exact Obito angle, the childhood romance with Rin driving the Eye of the Moon plan, the specific timeline of Obito was saved by Madara and brainwashed. Those pieces weren't all sitting in a neat binder from Tobi's first goofy appearance. So what do we do with the hints fans swear prove it was always Obito? The hair, That's just Kishimoto drawing within his own style. Half his cast has that hair. The eye injury. Any Uchiha in a mask with one eye visible is going to echo Obito, because Obito is the iconic Sharingan trauma kid. The vague, tragic lines. Those are generic enough to attach to multiple backstories. The mirrored panels. Those can be drawn after the decision is made, to retroactively rhyme with an old death scene. This is where I need you to be very precise with categories. Some of that is foreshadowing. There are a few lines and framing choices that almost certainly came after Kishimoto committed to Obito and started seeding the reveal. But a huge chunk of what the community worships as 500 chapter foreshadowing is actually smart retrofitting. Early ambiguity and flexible design that he later carved into a coherent twist. And this is not a sin. This is fine. This is normal serialized storytelling. An author leaves doors open. Then, when they finally decide which door to walk through, they repaint the hallway so it looks intentional. Emotionally, the Toby/Obito reveal works. Technically, it's a cocktail. Light foreshadowing, heavy retrofit, shaken with some production chaos. Hold that blend in your head, because in a second I'm going to pour that same drink over Zoro's Wano connection and see which parts were pre-written steel and which parts Oda hammered in later at the forge. So here's where we need a new word. Because if you only have foreshadowing and retrofitting in your toolbox, Oda keeps slipping through your fingers. You stare at Zoro in Wano, and your brain does that pattern-seeking monkey thing, where it sees Jesus in toast and goes, "Ah yes, perfect foreshadowing," even when that's not the category you actually mean. So I'm going to be honest with you. Pre-writing is not an academic term. There is no dusty literature professor out there grading papers on Oda's pre-writing praxis. I'm making this up. I need you to hear that. What I'm doing is slapping a label on a very specific behavior that doesn't sit cleanly in foreshadowing or in retrofit, and our community keeps arguing in circles because we don't have a word for the weird third thing. Here's the thing. Foreshadowing is when an author intentionally plants a detail because they already know the payoff. Retrofitting is when they go back and assign new meaning to an old detail. Pre-writing is different. Pre-writing is when an author plants a piece knowing it will matter later, but intentionally leaves the exact shape of the payoff open. The village name, the random sword, the vague legend are real seeds, but they're modular. They're built to be snapped into whatever future arc, theme, or mystery needs them. Oda is an outlier because he doesn't just pre-write isolated clues. He pre-writes entire systems, devil fruits, the D-clan, ancient kingdoms, sword grades. He builds these huge modular frameworks that can connect in multiple directions. So when he finally chooses one path in chapter 950, the thing he dropped in chapter 5 suddenly feels inevitable. Not because he predicted every micro detail on day one, but because he built the Lego set in advance and only later decided which model to assemble. Take the Will of D early on. It's just a weird middle initial and a spooky warning from Dr. Kureha. No definition, no lore dump. But you can feel it's central. That's pre-writing. Oda commits to the symbol and the emotional weight, the Stormbringer, enemy of the gods vibe, long before he nails down the exact historical explanation. He's not improvising it out of nowhere, and he's not foreshadowing a fully scripted PowerPoint. He's carrying a loaded concept he can slide into the Void Century, the ancient weapons, Emu, whatever the endgame needs. Now listen to me, because this is where Zoro walks in holding 3 swords and a giant question mark. Shimotsuki Village, Wado Ichimonji, Ryuma's legend from Thriller Bark. None of that is random, but none of it screams, this is a completed genealogy chart either. It looks exactly like a pre-written cluster. Names, symbols, and myths. Oda parked early, then later locked into Shimotsuki descendant, but not royalty, not reincarnation. And if that's true, then the real question isn't, who is Zoro's dad? It's why did Oda need Zoro to be a Shimotsuki at all? To answer that, we have to go back to a tiny village, a dead girl, and a sword that was never just a memento. So before we sprint into that village, we need to hit pause and ask a much uglier question. When Oda first sketched this green-haired menace on a cross in Shellstown, what did he actually know? Was he already thinking, this guy is from a Wano offshoot village and spiritually tied to Ryuma? Or was it closer to, this guy is my samurai-coded swordsman, future me can bolt him onto whatever samurai country I cook up? Because the community loves to jump straight to the galaxy brain answer. Of course he knew everything, 20 years ago, down to the blood type of Zoro's great-granduncle. And listen to me. That's comforting. That turns Oda into a prophecy machine instead of a working author with drafts, revisions, and regrets. But if we're going to argue pre-writing instead of miracle foreshadowing, we need to be precise about what was actually on the table early. Here's the thing. Oda told us from absurdly early on that if the crew were from real-world countries, Zoro would be from Japan. That's not a trivia joke. That is the author planting a flag that says, this is the samurai representative. Luffy is Brazil-coded chaos. Sanji is France-coded romance. Zoro is Japan-coded steel. So whatever country of samurai Oda had in his notes, Zoro was already thematically aligned with it from day one. But for years, Wano itself is vapor. It's just a phrase. The country of samurai. No geography, no Kozuki versus Kurazumi politics, no detailed family trees, no Shimotsuki clan produced this many guys with tragic eyebrows. It's a word Oda keeps repeating without cashing it in. That tells you something structural. The existence of a samurai nation is planned. The exact arrangement of its clans and bloodlines? That stays malleable for a very long time. And that, weirdly, makes Zoro the perfect pre-writing candidate. His entire aesthetic is screaming, plug me into the samurai slot. 3 swords, Caesar, the way he treats blades as partners rather than tools, the constant, I'll cut down the world's strongest swordsman, warrior ethos. Tying him to Wano down the line is not a shock twist. It's not retrofitting some random clown into royalty. It's the author consolidating a role the story already made him play from chapter 1. This is not a sin. This is not Oda cheating. This is how long-form storytelling survives serialization without collapsing under its own continuity. You pre-write the pillars, then you leave yourself wiggle room in the wallpaper. So the real diagnostic test isn't, does Zoro feel Wano-coded? Of course he does. That's the point. The real test is whether the earliest concrete nouns around him were already Wano infrastructure or just cool-sounding Japanese noise that Oda later weaponized. Was Shimotsuki village always a branch of a daimyo clan? Or did it start as samurai-flavored hometown and only later get promoted into a bloodline junction? I need you to sit with that uncertainty because it's about to matter. To see how intentional this was, we have to rewind to the very beginning, to that tiny dojo, to Kuina's grave, to a sword named Wado Ichimonji, and ask whether Oda was already loading the Shimotsuki gun, or if we're just pattern-seeking monkeys seeing Jesus in the toast of chapter 1. So let's rewind to that tiny dojo, because this is where the whole thing stops being Jesus in toast and starts being a smoking gun. Zoro is from Shimotsuki village. That phrase drops in the very first arc, in East Blue, in the most casual way imaginable. No ominous music, no lore dump. Just, yeah, he grew up in Shimotsuki village, and we all moved on because it sounded like generic katana-flavored wallpaper. Here's the thing. In a vacuum, Shimotsuki village is nothing. It's the kind of background detail an author throws in on a Tuesday. But then Wano shows up 20 years later, and suddenly, Shimotsuki is not a vibe, it's a surname. It's a daimyo family. It's Shimotsuki Ushimaru, the former daimyo of Ringo. It's Shimotsuki Kozaburo, the guy who forged Wado Ichimonji and Enma, and per Oda's own SBS, literally left Wano 55 years ago and founded Shimotsuki Village in East Blue. That is not a coincidence. That is not a random reuse. That is the map key being printed on page 1 and nobody noticing until the atlas is almost finished. I need you to actually sit with the probability here. Is it plausible that Oda just happened to name Zoro's hometown Shimotsuki, then decades later decided on a whim, oh, I'll turn that into a Wano clan and pretend it was foreshadowing? Technically, yes. Authors retrofit all the time. This is not a sin. This is normal. But when he then goes out of his way in an SBS to connect Kozaburo, Wado, Enma, and the founding of that exact village in a single clean chain, we have crossed out of the coincidence category. This is intentional cashing in on a pre-written seed. Even if he didn't have the entire family tree on a whiteboard in 1997, the decision to reuse Shimotsuki in Wano is Oda pointing back at that boring dojo flashback and saying, hey, that wasn't boring. That was a branch of Wano you just didn't know how to read yet. Zoro's random East Blue dojo kid origin quietly gets upgraded into product of a samurai offshoot colony without changing a single early chapter panel. Pattern interrupt. Notice what he doesn't do. He doesn't rename the clan. He doesn't say, oh, funny coincidence, different Shimotsuki. He doubles down and hard links them in paratext. That's the author telling the community, yes, you were supposed to connect this. So when fans argue about Zoro being a reincarnation, or a secret prince, or Ryuma 2.0 in a wig, we need to anchor ourselves in what is actually textually grounded. Oda has already confirmed the most boring, least clickbait angle. Zoro is a Shimotsuki descendant through that village. That's pillar number 1. Whatever crazy bloodline theory you build, it has to sit on this foundation. And once you accept that foundation, a bunch of other coincidences around Kuina, Kushiro and Wado Ichimonji stop being coincidences at all. So if those coincidences stop being coincidences, we need to walk back to the dojo where all of this started. Because that place was never just a random East Blue training hall. It was a Wano embassy with the serial numbers filed off. Start with Kushiro himself, calm, soft-spoken, perpetually in that loose robe that is one tailoring decision away from a full-on kimono. He's the classic samurai mentor archetype dropped into a sea of pirates and clown captains. The way he moves, the way he holds Wado Ichimonji, the way he talks about swords as extensions of the spirit rather than murder sticks for bounty hunting. That is Wano philosophy decades before we ever hear the word Wano. When he tells Zoro a sword can protect as well as kill, that's the same moral category Oda later puts in Kozaburo's mouth. That's not a vibe coincidence, that's foreshadowing. Now, names. Listen to me. In East Blue, you've got Helmeppo, Morgan, Kaya, Usopp, Johnny, Yosaku. Then you walk into this one tiny village and suddenly it's Kushiro, Kuina, Shimotsuki village. Full-on Japanese naming convention, clan name and all. This is not a sin. This is not bad subtlety. This is the author waving a giant, this is Wano adjacent flag, while trusting fans to be pattern-seeking monkeys who see Jesus in toast. Years later, when we meet Wano's daimyo families, and one of them is literally the Shimotsuki clan, that retroactively locks the village into a planned cultural alignment. Oda didn't roll a gacha for syllables and accidentally land on Shimotsuki. Then there's the sword style. The dojo doesn't treat swordsmanship as random East Blue fencing. It's a full discipline with rules, rankings, philosophy. Zoro's three-sword style is introduced as a serious, even controversial evolution of that tradition, not some gag he invented because he was bored. The story frames it as a legitimate school. Kuina is the prodigy, Zoro is the obsessive rival, Kushiro is the gatekeeper, who understands the danger and potential in what Zoro's doing. When you later learn that Shimotsuki Kozaburo forged Wado Ichimonji and Enma and left Wano to found this exact village, that entire dojo retroactively becomes Kozaburo's exported Wano style. The three-sword weirdness stops being a quirk and starts reading as an inherited mutated branch of Wano Kenjutsu. Here's the thing. Oda outright confirms in SBS that Kozaburo left Wano 55 years ago, founded Shimotsuki village, and made Wado and Enma. That means Koshiru is operating a school literally built on Wano steel and Wano ideology. Every kata Zoro runs, every lecture he gets about the weight of a sword, is downstream of a Shimotsuki daimyo family defector. So even if Koshiru isn't Zoro's biological father, Zoro's formative environment is aggressively Wano-coded on purpose, which raises a problem the community does not take seriously enough. If the village, the teacher, the heirloom sword, and the naming are all explicitly Shimotsuki, how plausible is it that Zoro's bloodline just isn't? This is normal for Oda. He builds the room, furnishes it with one clan's history, then asks you who you think lives there. And once you step into that room, you start noticing someone else's shadow on the wall. And in that shadow, there's one object that has been sitting in the dead center of the frame since East Blue. Not Zoro's eye, not his scar, not some tattoo you zoom in on with CSI filters. His sword. Wado Ichimonji. We need to go back to how Wado is introduced, because the community treats it as this generic, important sword when it's doing way more work than that. From day one, Wado is Zoro's soul. It's the blade he inherited from Kuina, the literal embodiment of their shared dream. He sleeps with it. He bites it in his mouth. When Mihawk shatters his other swords, Wado is the one that survives. The story quietly tells you, this is non-negotiable. If Zoro loses Wado, he's not Zoro. Now, at that point, all you know is treasured heirloom, emotional core, cool white scabbard. That's it. No Wano, no samurai country, no clan chart. Just a boy, a dead friend, and a promise welded to steel. And this is where fans turn into that pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast. We feel that it's special, so we start inventing mystical explanations. Cursed destiny sword, secret god blade, whatever. Except here's the thing. Years later, Oda just walks into an SBS and drops a filing cabinet on our heads. He confirms that Shimotsuki Kozaburo forged Wado Ichimonji. Same guy forged Enma. Same guy left Wano 55 years ago, sailed out, and founded Shimotsuki village. That means the sword, the village, and the old man who created both are all on a straight, author-confirmed pipeline from Wano to Zoro's backstory. Listen to me. That is not vague samurai aesthetic foreshadowing. That is a documented supply chain. Wano to Kozaburo, to Shimotsuki village, to Kuina, and Koshiru, to Zoro to Wado, on his hip from Chapter 3. From the second Wado appears, you are staring at a Wano artifact made by the guy who literally built Zoro's hometown. You just don't have the label yet. So, what category is this? Is Wado classical foreshadowing, or is it a retrofit? I'd call it pre-writing that later behaves as foreshadowing. Oda clearly planned for Wado to be uniquely important. It's visually distinct, mechanically favored by the plot, and emotionally central. The specific detail, this was forged by Kozaburo, a Wano exile who founded your village, can be filled in later, but the slot for special ancestral blade with future relevance is there from the start. This is not a sin. This is not Oda winging it. This is how intentional long-form writing works. You pre-write the skeleton, Zoro's connection to a foreign samurai lineage. Then you decide which vertebra gets the Wano tag when you need it. And it absolutely annihilates the reincarnation and secret prince problem. You don't need Zoro to be Ryuma reborn when the author has already given you a clean, mundane, brutally grounded explanation. He's carrying a Shimotsuki blade, from a Shimotsuki founder, from a Shimotsuki village. The Bloodline reading isn't what if, it's the default. I need you to hold on to that, because once you accept Wado as a pre-written Wano tether, the rest of Zoro's arsenal stops being random loot and starts reading like a carefully curated family archive. Once you see Wado as a Wano tether, you can't unsee the rest of it. Suddenly, East Blue Zoro stops being generic cool swordsman guy and starts reading as this author quietly dropped a Ronin into a pirate manga and hoped you wouldn't ask questions. Go back to chapter 1 Zoro. The guy chained up in Shellstown isn't some chaotic brawler. He's strict training, self-imposed starvation, and a handshake deal with a little girl that he treats as a binding contract. He insists on a fair duel with Helmeppo's dad. He's ready to die in that courtyard rather than bend his own rules. That's not standard pirate thug energy. That's wandering swordsman who accidentally spawned in the wrong genre. Once he joins Luffy, it only escalates. He's willing to die for his captain's dream before he even fully understands it. He demands that Luffy never lose again, and then structures his entire code around backing that up. He challenges Mihawk in a one-on-one, face-to-face, cut me down from the front duel. This is not a guy optimized for efficient piracy. This is a guy optimized for a moral duel in a sunset field where someone gives a speech about honor. Now fast forward in your head to Wano's samurai. Stoic resolve? Check. Respect for worthy opponents? Zoro bows to Mihawk's superiority, pledges to surpass him, and never cheapens that promise. Willingness to bear scars and curses for conviction? East Blue already gives you the template. He takes Mihawk's wound to the chest, then later in Alabasta, he's casually tanking Mr. East One's blades, treating permanent damage as the tax you pay for the path you chose. So here's the thing, is that just Oda dipping into the cultural toolbox because he's a Japanese author who grew up on Chambara movies, or is this intentional Wano pre-writing? The community loves to pretend this is a binary. Either Oda had a corkboard labelled Shimotsuki Zoro in 1997, or it's all coincidence. I need you to stop doing that. This is not a sin. This is not how writing works. What Oda can do is build a structural role before he nails every family tree branch. Zoro is positioned from day one as the samurai-coded straw hat. The bridge between East Blue and whatever country of samurai he's clearly saving for later. Even if the exact Shimotsuki bloodline wasn't fully planned, the aesthetic and ethos are so tightly aligned that when Wano finally walks on stage, it almost has to claim him. If it didn't, that would be the weird decision. Pattern interrupt. Imagine a version of One Piece where Zoro never meets a single Wano character. No Ryuma, no Enma, no Kozaburo. Does that feel plausible to you? Or does it feel broken, like someone ripped a page out of the outline? And that's where Thriller Bark quietly flips the switch. Up to that point, Zoro feels samurai-coded. On Thriller Bark, the story stops flirting and hands him Ryuma's shadow duel. Suddenly, he isn't just a Ronin vibe in a vacuum, he's crossing blades with Wano's literal god of the blade. The scars, the honor, the Dragon Slayer parallels all get stapled to a specific lineage. Next, we need to talk about how that fight doesn't just foreshadow Wano. It prototypes Zoro's entire bloodline reveal. So, Thriller Bark. This is where Oda stops hinting and just throws Zoro into a simulation of his own bloodline without telling you that's what he's doing. Zoro versus Ryuma is not a random mid-arc boss fight. It's a prototype reveal wearing a Halloween costume. First, the beats. Zoro and Ryuma clash steel on a burning rooftop. There's no grudge, no tragic flashback, no "you killed my sensei" speech. It's just two swordsmen testing whether the other's soul is heavy enough to bend their blades. They trade blows, they test each other's resolve, and Ryuma keeps getting more amused. Not angry, amused, respectful. When Zoro finally pushes through, Ryuma doesn't curse him. He laughs, acknowledges his spirit, and willingly hands over Shusui, not as loot, as recognition. This black blade is yours now. That is a knighting ceremony disguised as a drop table. Now, visually and thematically, Oda is screaming at you with a megaphone. Scar across the same eye line. Similar jaw, similar silhouette. That same, I will cut God if he stands in my way posture. Both are dragon slayers from a country of samurai whose very presence turns into folklore. Ryuma has the dragon-slaying legend in Wano's past. Zoro gets his own dragon moment later with Pika, and then again with Kaido's dragon form. You are supposed to feel that these two exist in the same narrative category of myth with a sword attached. Here's the thing. Ryuma himself is already a retrofit. He comes from Oda's one-shot monsters long before One Piece. Oda reaches back into his drawer, pulls out this standalone Wano swordsman and staples him into the main story as a legendary samurai whose corpse got stolen. That is textbook retrofitting, the author recycling and upgrading his own idea after the fact. This is not a sin. This is fine. This is normal professional storytelling. But what happens once Ryuma is inside One Piece? That's where we need to change categories. The way Ryuma reads Zoro's soul, calls out his strength, and then entrusts Shusui is not random. It feels intentional in a way that goes beyond cool fight. It functions as pre-writing for Zoro is connected to this man and this country, even if Oda hadn't yet locked in the exact Shimotsuki family tree. You don't have a legendary Wano hero personally certify some East Blue nobody unless you already planned for that nobody to matter to Wano's history. And this is where the community lost its mind. Reincarnation. Zoro is Ryuma reborn. I need you to hear me. This is our pattern-seeking monkey brain seeing Jesus in toast. The parallels are loud on purpose, but the text never says, you are Ryuma. What it actually says is, you carry the same kind of will and strength. That's a completely different category. Will, not soul recycling. Lineage and inherited ideals, not literal respawn. Because if Thriller Bark is the prototype reveal, Wano is the patch notes that finally explain why that rooftop duel ever happened. And who exactly? Zoro has been echoing this entire time. So when you hear Zoro is Ryuma reincarnated, what you're actually hearing is the community trying to describe that echo with the wrong vocabulary. And I need you to really sit with that, because on the surface, the reincarnation theory sounds airtight. Same scar across the eye, same dragon slaying feat, same country of samurai origin. Ryuma's zombie singling Zoro out on Thriller Bark, handing him Shusui. Then you get to Wano, and suddenly every third person is staring at this green-haired tourist like they've just seen a ghost. Kawamatsu clocks his aura. Hiyori plays the Shusui/Enma swap card. Old folks whisper about Ryuma when he walks past. If you're a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast, your brain goes, oh, reincarnation, done. This is not a sin. This is normal. Your brain is doing what it's supposed to do. The problem is that reincarnation is the wrong category for how One Piece actually treats souls and history. Here's the thing. This series almost never uses literal reincarnation as a storytelling tool. When Oda talks about souls, he talks about them staying on ships, or in shadows, or haunting promises. When he talks about the past shaping the future, he reaches for inherited will, not press X to respawn in a new body. The will of D is not the same guy being reborn every few decades. It's a chain of people carrying the same defiant idea. Poseidon is not the same mermaid reincarnating. It's a bloodline job posting that keeps getting filled. So if the author already has a clean, intentional term for the past living on in the present, why would he suddenly introduce a one-off metaphysical body swap just for Zoro? Where is the foreshadowing for actual reincarnation as a mechanic? There isn't any. We get shadows, homies, souls ripped out by Big Mom, but never, congrats, you rolled New Game Plus and came back as your own descendant. Instead, we get the exact same pattern he uses everywhere else. Luffy inherits Roger's will and dream. Momonosuke inherits Oden's mission and burden. Vivi inherits Cobra's role. None of them are framed as literal returns. They're continuations. The torch passes. The person doesn't respawn. Listen to me. Wano's dialogue is extremely careful about this. They compare Zoro's aura to Ryuma's. They talk about his swordsmanship, his presence, his resemblance. They react to Shusui in his hands and to Enma choosing him. But nobody ever drops the obvious line, "You are Ryuma reborn." For a country that will straight up tell you your family crimes to your face, that silence is loud. So reincarnation ends up being fandom overreach. Pattern-hungry, toast Jesus overreach. We see scars and dragons and samurai, and we jump to the most dramatic explanation instead of the most Oda explanation. And the most Oda explanation is way more grounded and honestly scarier, bloodline plus inherited will. Zoro not as Ryuma's second life, but as the planned payoff of a Shimotsuki story that started 55 years before Chapter 1. Which means we need to stop asking, is he Ryuma? And start asking a much better question. Who built a village around this kid? And why did Wano send its blades into East Blue in the first place? So this is where the fandom brain does a hard swerve. We go, Shimotsuki village, Ryuma parallels, Wano swords. Therefore Zoro is a lost samurai prince, separated at birth, destined to reclaim the shogunate. It's the Disney Channel version of Bloodline mystery. Secret heir, tragic backstory, crown waiting in the attic with the Christmas decorations. The clean version of the theory is always the same. Zoro is either a direct Shimotsuki daimyo heir, or, if you really want to speedrun fanfiction, part of the Kazuki main shogun line. He's smuggled out of Wano as a baby, raised in East Blue by Koshiro, and one day he comes back, reveals his crest, and everyone goes, "My lord, the rightful shogun has returned." That's the fantasy. That's the category the community keeps defaulting to. Here's the thing. That is not how Oda writes royalty. At all. When Oda makes you royal, your entire arc gets stapled to your country. Vivi is not cool desert girl who travels. Vivi is Alabasta. Every tear, every decision is about that kingdom. Shirahoshi is literally an ancient weapon, but narratively she's Poseidon the princess, chained to Fishman Island's fate. Rebecca's whole story is Dressrosa's trauma. Momonosuke? The kid cannot walk 3 panels without someone reminding you he's the heir, the symbol, the political problem. Notice the pattern. Royalty in One Piece is not a stat buff. It's a job. It's paperwork, responsibility, succession crises. It drags the story into governance, treaties, and who sits on what chair when the credits roll. That's intentional. That's how this author uses class and nobility in his storytelling. Now put Zoro in that category and watch the entire structure break. Zoro's function on the crew is aggressively pure. He is the warrior slot on the character sheet. His dream is brutally simple. Become the world's greatest swordsman. His internal compass is about strength, honor, and keeping promises, not tax codes. The second you hand him a throne, his arc stops being, how far will he go for his captain's dream? And starts being, how will he balance national policy with his own ambitions? Congratulations, you've just spawned a second protagonist-level political plot in a story that's already juggling Void Century, ancient weapons, and the actual Pirate King. And Oda knows this. Watch how he stages Wano. When the real heir, Momonosuke, is on screen, Zoro is always framed as protector, executor of will, enforcer of the shogun's dream. He carries Odin's blades, he slays dragons, he cuts down Kaido's aura. But at no point does anyone in story treat him as a rival claimant. Nobody whispers, shouldn't he be shogun instead? The narrative never even flirts with that problem. Pattern interrupt. If Oda wanted Zoro to be a prince, he's already had the perfect window to say it. He didn't. Instead, he threads a much sharper needle. Zoro gets the prestige of being tied to a legendary clan and a god-tier swordsman. Shimotsuki village, Kozaburo forging Wado and Enma, Wano samurai reacting to him like he's Ryuma's echo. This is all planned. Intentional bloodline foreshadowing. But it's prestige without paperwork. He's descended from greatness, not from a job title. And I need you to hold on to that, because the moment you drop the secret prince fantasy, a much scarier version of his inheritance comes into focus. So when you strip away the secret prince headcanon, you're left staring at the one old man who actually matters, Shimotsuki Kozaburo. And listen to me, this is where the story stops being vibes and starts being paperwork. Oda spells it out in an SBS. 55 years ago, Kozaburo illegally leaves Wano. Not travels, not is dispatched, literally defects. He gets blown to East Blue, beats up some bandits, and instead of just settling down quietly, he founds a village. Shimotsuki Village. The place Zoro is from is not random geography. It is a Wano crime scene with houses. Then Oda casually drops the grenade. This same guy forged Wado Ichimonji and Enma. The sword Zoro carries from Chapter 3 and the sword that will define his Wano arc both come from the same missing samurai who built his hometown. Here's the thing. That retroactively rewires Zoro's entire childhood. His village exists because a Wano samurai washed ashore and refused to stop being Wano. The dojo where he trains exists because that man's descendants institutionalized his sword culture. The ordinary katana he's been using for 1,000 chapters is actually a national treasure smuggled out of a closed country by a political refugee. You are not looking at a coincidence. You are looking at an author finally turning the lights on in a room he built decades ago. We need to talk about Kozaburo's philosophy too, because Oda doesn't just give him lore, he gives him doctrine. Kozaburo tells young Zoro that swords are made to cut, but a sword that only thirsts for killing is a demon. A true swordsman chooses how that power is used, to protect, to carry someone's will. Fast forward and Wano samurai talk about blades with the same religious hush. Enma is the sword that tests whether your haki and your resolve are worthy. Ryuma's legend is framed around protecting Wano's honor, not racking up a kill count. Zoro's later growth, learning to tame cursed blades, to control his killing intent, to dedicate his strength to his captain, sounds exactly like a kid finally understanding the weird rant the old guy at the park gave him 20 years ago. Categorically, this is pre-writing. Kozaburo, the village, the dojo, Wado, they were always sitting there as loose nouns. Then Wano happens, and Oda cashes them in as a unified backstory. The random East Blue dojo is retrofitted into a Wano colony. But it only works this cleanly if the author had already decided, on some level, that Zoro's origin point was Shimotsuki coded from day one. This is not a sin. This is not sloppy. This is how long-form storytelling survives 25 years without collapsing. And the implication is brutal. If Kozaburo founds the village and his bloodline runs the dojo, then Zoro growing up there, being chosen by that sword, being recognized by Enma, is not spiritually random. No, I'm not saying Koshiro is secretly his dad. I'm saying statistically, in a tiny founder village, the kid who inherits the heirloom from the founder's line is almost certainly carrying some Shimotsuki DNA, even if the family tree looks like a conspiracy board. And I need you to sit with that. Because once you accept that Zoro is a quiet Shimotsuki by blood, The way Wano reacts to him stops being a fun coincidence and turns into something much, much harder to explain away. So once you accept quiet Shimotsuki by blood, we need to talk about the elephant in Zoro's mouth, three-sword style. Because on paper, it's ridiculous. It is objectively stupid. You are watching a man clamp a katana between his teeth and do parkour. This is not classical kendo. This is not any recognized real-world school. This is a shonen author going, what if swords, but more? And because of that, the community has this lazy reflex take. Oh, Oda just made that up for cool factor. Flashy gimmick, no lineage. I need you to pause on that. Because if everything else around Zoro is this meticulously planned Wano export, why would his single most defining trait be the one thing that's pure nonsense? That asymmetry is the problem. Here's the thing. In story, nobody treats three-sword style as a meme. Zoro doesn't wake up at 17 and decide to cosplay a food processor. He's grinding this from childhood. Kuina is sparring him when they're kids. Kushiru is watching, correcting, pushing. There is zero panel where the teacher goes, ha ha ha, funny bit, anyway, here's real swordsmanship. The writing frames it as a legitimate discipline that evolves. Onigiri, then Lion Song, then Asura, then King of Hell. That's a curriculum, not a gag. And if you're into this framework, we need to keep going. I'm already sketching follow-ups where we run the same lens on Blackbeard's three-skull Jolly Roger and body horror, on Imu's impossible authority, on the Will of D as a pre-written inheritance plot versus a late thematic retrofit. If you want those deep dives, tell me which one to dissect first and drop the receipts you want on the operating table. Because listen to me, we just spent roughly 2 hours untangling one devil fruit and one red-haired pirate. One fruit. One guy who won't even stay on screen for 10 chapters. And if that doesn't prove that we have completely lost the plot in the best, most obsessive, most community-brained way possible, nothing will. So subscribe, hit the thing, grab your notes, and I'll see you in the next autopsy. So where does a curriculum come from in One Piece? It comes from a school, from a tradition, from a guy named Shimotsuki Kozaburo who walks out of Wano 55 years ago, forges Wado Ichimonji, forges Enma, and then just so happens to found the exact village where a green-haired demon child starts biting swords. You can call me a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast, but at some point the toast starts talking back. No, I'm not saying Kozaburo was out here teaching toddlers, put the blade in your mouth, champ. The three-sword configuration can be Zoro's own insanity. This is fine. This is normal. What I'm saying is that the underlying forms, the philosophy of cutting, the whole swords choose their wielder. A blade reflects the heart framework. That is straight up Shimotsuki/Wano doctrine. Three-sword style is Zoro, taking that doctrine and stress testing it until it screams. And Wano's reaction proves it. When samurai see him, they're shocked by the mouth thing, sure, but they do not treat his fundamentals as alien. Kawamatsu watches his cuts and nods. Hiyori entrusts Enma to him because his sword aura feels right. The scabbards recognize his techniques as compatible with their own heritage. The quirk is new, the core is familiar. So three-sword style lands in this hybrid category. It's a personal innovation growing out of a Shimotsuki base. Zoro is both the product of a bloodline and the guy breaking its ceiling. And if that's true, then the next question isn't, is he Wano? It's why the story needs a Shimotsuki outlier who can rewrite the rules of the blade in the first place. And here's where we test whether that Shimotsuki outlier idea is just me being a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast, or whether the story has been quietly training you for Wano since East Blue. Go back to Logtown. Zoro doesn't treat sword shopping as a gag. He walks into Ippon Matsu's shop with this obsessive, almost reverent focus on quality. Named blades, grades, histories. While Luffy is busy getting executed and struck by God's personal lightning bolt, Zoro is having a theological debate with gravity over whether a cursed sword will accept him. That whole Sandai Kitetsu scene is framed as a test of will. The author is already telling you. For this guy, swords aren't tools, they're destiny delivery systems, and Ipponmatsu's reaction is important. He's terrified of Kitetsu, but when Zoro wins the bet, he doesn't go, "Wow, crazy pirate." He goes respectful. He gifts Zoro a famed grade blade, Wado's Pier, because he recognizes a certain category of swordsman. We don't have the word Wano stamped on it yet, but the storytelling is doing the work. Cursed blades, named craftsmen, willpower trials. That's the Wano sword culture skeleton before Wano even exists on the page. Then you hit Alabasta and watch Zoro in a desert full of rebels, royal guards, Baroque works freaks. Who feels out of place? Not as a joke, but as an aesthetic. Zoro is the one kneeling in front of Mr. One, meditating on the breath of all things. He's the guy turning a shonen power-up into a Zen koan. No one calls him a samurai, but he is very clearly the swordsman from a different tradition, dropped into pirate anarchy. I need you to clock how consistent that is. Here's the thing. Explicit Wano mentions are rare, but they cluster around Zoro's lane. We hear about a country of samurai in world-building chatter. We see legendary blades treated as national treasures. When the story needs an excuse to talk about Meito rankings, swordsmiths, or cursed lineages, who gets the panel time? Zoro. Not Usopp. Not Sanji. The narrative keeps routing sword culture exposition through him, which is not an accident in a series this planned. Most of this is not clean. Courtroom grade foreshadowing where Oda has already written Shimotsuki Kozaburo left Wano 55 years ago in a notebook. This is pre-writing plus thematic alignment. He knows there is a samurai nation. He knows he has a swordsman protagonist. So he keeps dropping Zoro into situations that resonate with that future reveal, even if the proper nouns aren't on the table yet. This is not a sin. This is not the author cheating. This is how long-form writing survives 20 plus years. So by the time we actually dock in Wano and the arc points at Zoro and goes, "Yeah, you're one of ours," the community doesn't riot. You accept it. It feels inevitable. Because you've already watched him pass cursed blade trials, meditate on sword spirits, embody a stoic code that doesn't match pirate culture. Wano isn't a twist grafted onto his character. It's the country that finally has a name for what he's been the entire time. Which raises a different problem. If the setup is that thorough before we even meet a single samurai, what happens when we factor in Ryuma and Thriller Bark retroactively? So when we finally hit Wano, that what happens question stops being theoretical and walks on screen in a kimono. The crew crashes through the waterfall, everybody's in cosplay, and it's chaos. Nami's a kunoichi gag, Usopp's a peddler, Sanji's a walking food stall. They all feel dressed up. Zoro steps into Wano, and the panel composition basically sighs in relief. The top knot, the kimono, the swords at his hip. This isn't a costume, it's an uninstall prompt for the word foreigner. He doesn't look adapted to Wano. Wano looks retrofitted around him. Here's the thing. Oda draws that difference on purpose. The others are framed as outsiders bumping into a closed country. Zoro is framed as a missing piece sliding into a puzzle. When he's wandering around town with that stolen seppuku sword scandal, the citizens don't react to him as some clown tourist playing samurai. They're shocked at his audacity, not his authenticity. The whole Ronin who got framed and sentenced sequence reads less pirate abroad and more local problem child who won't follow the shogun's rules. Watch how Wano swordsmen respond to him. The random samurai who see his stance. The way people clock Wado Ichimonji instantly. treat it as a national treasure in the hands of someone who, suspiciously, swings it like he was born with it. Kawamatsu, Hiyori, even the fodder retainers, their reactions are not, "Wow, this foreigner learned our style." Their reactions are, "Why does this guy feel like home?" That's a different storytelling category. That's not coincidence. That's intentional. And Oda starts feeding him into the country's spiritual infrastructure immediately. Zoro at Yasui's grave. Zoro standing in front of shrines, praying in the Wano style without anyone having to teach him. Zoro hearing about Ryuma, the dragon-slaying god of the blade from a country of samurai, and the manga quietly putting his scar, his silhouette, his dragon-killing resume on the same visual axis. I need you to notice how little exposition he needs to fit. The story just assumes he belongs. At this point, Oda is not pre-writing anymore. He's cashing the check. 20-plus years of samurai coding, Shimotsuki Village, Kuina, Kushiru, Wado Ichimonji. All those fragments stop being cute trivia and start behaving like a planned lineage reveal. Wano isn't where he discovers swords. It's where the global narrative finally admits, out loud, that this guy is a Shimotsuki-tied swordsman whose entire life was a controlled export of Wano steel and Wano will. And we need to talk about the moment the country itself admits it too. Because all of this, the aesthetics, the reactions, the shrines, the Ryuma whispers, is just the runway. The real takeoff is when a certain cursed blade forged by Shimotsuki Kozaburo, twin to Wado Ichimonji, chooses Zoro in front of witnesses. That's the point where bloodline, will and weapon stop being foreshadowing and become a signed contract. And when Enma bites down on his arm, the story finally answers the question Wano has been quietly asking since he walked in. So we need to talk about that scene. Hiyori kneels, unwraps Enma, and the room temperature drops 10 degrees. She warns him, "This sword is wild. It crippled grown samurai. It was Odin's problem child." Any normal person hears that and backs away slowly. Zoro hears that and goes, "Yeah, sure, pass me the man-eating katana." The second his hand closes on the hilt, his arm shrivels as Enma guzzles his haki, and everyone in that room is ready to call a medic. This is not a cute training montage. This is a cursed blade trying to eat its user in one bite. And then Zoro does the insane thing. He bites back. He regulates the drain, forces his haki out on his own terms, and suddenly this unwieldy national treasure is purring in his hand. Here's the thing. That isn't just a power-up scene. That's a payoff scene. Oda had already told you in an SBS that Shimotsuki Kozaburo forged both Wado Ichimonji and Enma, and that he left Wano, founded Shimotsuki Village, and essentially hand-delivered his legacy to baby Zoro. The sword Zoro cried over as a child, and the sword that chooses him in Wano are twins from the same author-planted craftsman. So when Hiyori says, "This was my father's sword," the story is quietly saying, "And this was always your problem." Wado and Enma are not random drops from the loot table. They are a match set, a planned through line from East Blue to Wano. You do not accidentally make the hometown, the childhood sword, and the cursed heirloom all trace back to one Shimotsuki smith. That's intentional writing, not a pattern-seeking monkey seeing Jesus in toast. Now, watch the in-story reactions. Kawamatsu and Hiyori are not just impressed, they are disturbed. The retainers know what Enma did to Odin's retainers in training. They know this thing hollowed out seasoned samurai. So when an outsider not only survives the drain, but pushes more haki through than Odin ever did, the room collectively goes, "Who is this man?" Are they reacting to raw numbers or to recognition? This is where the community splits the scene into two bad categories. Either Enma recognizes his Shimotsuki bloodline, or Enma recognizes his will, blood or spirit, clan or character. And I need you to understand, Oda is absolutely greedy enough to do both at once. This is not a sin. This is normal. The author can intend Enma to resonate with a descendant of Kozaburo's people, whose ambition mirrors Oden and Ryuma. So yes, it's bloodline coded. The Shimotsuki name, the village, the shared smith, all scream genealogy. But it's also will coded. Zoro's whole storytelling arc is about a swordsman whose spirit can tame cursed blades. The genius is that Oda never has the sword say, "Ah yes, my fellow Shimotsuki." He lets the compatibility, the reactions, and the craftsmanship do the foreshadowing. And in terms of our categories, this scene is pure, distilled payoff. Kozaburo's flashback, Wado's origin, Shimotsuki village, Zoro's lifelong bond with that one white sword, they all converge here too cleanly to be retrofit. You don't retroactively decide 50 plus volumes in that your protagonist's right-hand man just happens to dual-wield twin Shimotsuki masterpieces from a clan-name village that leads straight back to Wano. Listen to me. Enma choosing Zoro is the contract being signed in ink that was bottled in East Blue. And the moment that contract is signed, the story quietly opens the door to an even bigger question. If the swords have already recognized him, what exactly are they recognizing him for? So here's where Wano stops being a backdrop and starts acting like a paternity test. The moment Zoro steps into that country, people don't just go, "Oh wow, strong foreigner." They keep doing this weird double take, this squint, as if their brain is trying to overlay another silhouette on top of him. Kawamatsu literally says, Zoro's swordsmanship and presence remind him of the daimyo he once served. He's not reacting to raw power, he's reacting to familiarity. Hiyori is even worse for my sanity. She meets this scarred, green-haired swordsman carrying Wado and Enma. And what does she do? She falls asleep on him in the middle of danger. That's not a normal reaction to a pirate you met 5 minutes ago. That's the storytelling equivalent of your dog sprinting to a stranger because they smell like your old house. She calls him Oni-chan. She treats him as safe, as if some ancestral memory is telling her, "You know this presence." And then you have the samurai and townsfolk whispering about Shusui. When they see Zoro wielding the stolen national treasure of Wano, the sword of Ryuma himself, the conversation is not, "How dare this outsider?" It's that stance, that aura. He reminds us of the god of the blade. They compare him to a literal legend. They frame his dragon slaying on the rooftop as history folding in on itself. Here's the thing, they never do this with Luffy or Kid. Luffy punches a dragon in the face, knocks out Kaido, and Wano's reaction is, "Joy Boy, the man who will save this country?" It's mythic, but it's future-facing. Kid wreaks havoc and they go, "Scary pirate captain, very loud, please leave." Respect, fear, awe, sure. But nobody is staring at Luffy and saying, "You feel like someone we lost 400 years ago." That category is reserved for Zoro. Listen to me, this is not just flavor text. This is intentional framing. Oda is using Wano's point of view as an in-universe chorus to tell you what Zoro is, before any SBS chart ever spells out Shimotsuki descendant. When Kawamatsu sees Zoro handle Enma, when Hiyori watches him adapt to that cursed blade's will, their awe isn't, "Wow, strong swordsman." It's, "Of course Enma chose you," as if the sword is simply returning to its own blood. Pattern interrupt for you. Imagine Zoro had 0 Wano ties. Same feats, same strength, no Shimotsuki breadcrumbs. Do you really think Oda has Hiyori casually hand him Enma, heirloom of her family, and then frame that as destiny rather than desperation? That's not foreshadowing anymore. That's the author screaming through the panel borders. And this is where inherited will and bloodline in One Piece quietly merge. It's not about DNA tests or family trees. It's about how the world reacts to you as if you're the continuation of something older. The swords recognize him. Wano's people recognize him. the legend of Ryuma recognizes him, which means before we even draw a family tree, we need to ask a better question. What unfinished story is Zoro being drafted into? So when we talk about what unfinished story is Zoro being drafted into, we need to walk up that hill in Ringo and actually look at the dirt. Because Oda doesn't answer that question with a speech. He answers it with tombstones. You get that wide shot of the graveyard, Shimotsukimon on the markers, snow on the ground, the remains of a lost daimyo line literally buried. Shimotsuki Ushimaru, Shimotsuki Yasui. Names that, for Wano, are recent history, but for you, are retroactive context for a guy we met tied to a pole in Chapter 3. Then you remember, Zoro grew up in Shimotsuki Village, not random Kendo Town number 4. The author stamped the clan name on his origin point from day one. Here's the thing. Oda then drops the SBS nuke. Shimotsuki Kozaburo left Wano 55 years ago, sailed out illegally, founded a village in East Blue, forged Wado Ichimonji and Enma, and died there. Do the math. Kushiru is middle-aged when Zoro is a kid. Kuina's around Zoro's age, and Zoro is 19 pre-time skip. That timeline is clean. One generation from Kozaburo to Kushiru, one more to Kuina's cohort. The mysterious foreign sword school in a random East Blue village stops being mysterious and becomes a planned export of Wano's samurai culture. Fans saw that and immediately did what fans do. We became pattern-seeking monkeys seeing Jesus in toast, drawing family trees in MS Paint. Is Kushiru Kozaburo's son? Grandson? Is Kuina Zoro's secret cousin? Does that make Zoro an Ushimaru grandkid or some collateral branch? The community has a whole taxonomy of Shimotsuki Zoro diagrams. Some of them are plausible. Some of them are conspiracy corkboard. But when you separate foreshadowing from fan fiction, you get a narrower, more intentional core. Oda has said in SBS that Kushiru is Kozaburo's descendant and that Shimotsuki village was founded by that Wano emigrant group. That's supported. Zoro being directly related by blood to Kozaburo is heavily implied but not stamped with a yes grandson label. Zoro being tied to Ushimaru specifically, that's a step further out in the speculative category, riding on facial resemblance and vibes more than explicit writing. And I need you to notice what Oda refuses to do. He never has a character turn to Zoro and say, "You are the grandson of Daimyo X." No melodramatic genealogy scroll. No "I am your father" panel. Instead, he stacks the data, the village name, the swords, the graveyard, the SBS timeline. Then he walks away. If you're paying attention, there's only one reasonable conclusion. Zoro is of Shimotsuki stock, raised in a Shimotsuki village, wielding Shimotsuki blades. The exact branch? This is not a sin to leave undefined. This is fine. This is normal for how Oda handles bloodline foreshadowing. Because the story doesn't need Zoro to be a secret prince. It needs him to be the inheritor of a tradition. And once you see that, you start asking a much more dangerous question. If Oda quietly confirmed Shimotsuki Zoro without saying it, what else has he already confirmed that we haven't caught yet? So here's where the community completely trips over its own feet. We see Shimotsuki Zoro and our brains instantly go, "Ah, secret samurai prince, bloodline power-up, mystery solved." And I need you to slow down, take a breath, and remember what series we're actually reading. Because across One Piece, Oda has been screaming the opposite lesson at you for 25 years. Luffy is not Roger's kid. That entire Roger Dragon Garp chain exists specifically to prove that the Pirate King's crown is not hereditary hardware. Luffy inherits Roger's will, not his blood. Robin doesn't have some Ohara gene that lets her read poneglyphs. She inherits Ohara's will to uncover the Void Century. Momonosuke inherits Odin's will to open Wano, not a magic Odin stat buff. Even Shirahoshi, who is literally Poseidon by blood, still has to choose whether she'll be a weapon or a savior. The pattern is intentional. The author is drawing a hard category difference between blood and will. Now plug Zoro into that system, and everything snaps into focus. Zoro doesn't get a Shimotsuki transformation. He gets Wado Ichimonji, and a dead girl's dream stapled to his soul. Kuina's will is literally in his hands every time he draws that sword. He trains under Koshiro and absorbs Kozaburo's philosophy about what a good sword is, about a blade not being evil, about the swordsman bearing responsibility. That's inherited will. Then he walks into Thriller Bark, cuts down a dragon corpse wearing Ryuma's shadow, and years later, Wano basically goes, "Oh, that wasn't a gag. That was our god of the blade handing you the job." Ryuma, Kuina, Kozaburo, Wano's samurai culture, they're all pushing, but none of them can make him move. Zoro still has to choose. Here's the thing. In One Piece, Bloodline is rarely about a secret power unlock. It's about who gets to dump their unfinished business on your doorstep. Dragon's Blood doesn't give Luffy Gear 5. The Gomu Gomu no Mi and Nika foreshadowing do. The Vinsmoke genes give Sanji exoskeleton nonsense, sure, but the real story is him rejecting their expectations. Blood is a delivery system for pressure. Will is what you do with it. So when Oda quietly aligns Zoro with the Shimotsuki, it isn't some lazy explaining his strength patch. It's giving his absurd, almost religious obsession with swords and honor a historical backbone. It says, this isn't random shonen grind. This is a guy standing in a lineage of dragon slayers and village founders, trying to decide what that tradition actually means. And listen to me, that is so much more dangerous for storytelling than Zoro is Ryuma 2.0, which means the real mystery was never who is Zoro's dad. The real question is, whose will did Oda need Zoro to embody for the endgame to work? Ryuma's legend, Kozaburo's craftsmanship, Kuina's impossible dream, the Shimotsuki ethos of duty over status. That's the cocktail. The bloodline is just the paperwork, and if that's the frame, then we need to go one step further and ask, what exactly is that inherited will pointing toward? Because Oda has already shown us the answer. He just hid it in the one place fans almost never scrutinize as foreshadowing. The swords themselves. The swords themselves. And this is exactly where Oda pulls his nastiest magic trick with Zoro's name. Because listen to me. We have been reading this series for over 25 years, and one of the three main characters still does not have a spoken, in-story surname. Luffy is Monkey D. Luffy. Sanji gets upgraded to Vinsmoke Sanji. Meanwhile, the green-haired murder machine? Just Roronoa Zoro. Period. End of file. No Shimotsuki ever leaves anyone's mouth. Here's the thing. That's not an accident. That is an intentional omission. The author who will stop the entire narrative so a random side character can dump their full government name and tragic backstory somehow forgets to have anyone in Wano say, "Oh, you must be Shimotsuki Zoro." No, that's planned. That's restraint. Because the second you canonize Shimotsuki Zoro in the actual story, you change his category in the audience's head. He stops being the guy who crawled out of a village dojo and bench-pressed reality through sheer will, and becomes the lost heir of a daimyo clan. The focus tilts from grind to genealogy, from swordsman to surname. And for a character whose entire ethos is self-made strength, that is a problem. Oda has already watched what happens when a last name detonates. Vinsmoke Sanji instantly reframed every bounty joke, every North Blue detail, every Mr. Prince gag as foreshadowing. Same with Monkey D. Luffy and the Will of D. Those names are giant neon arrows that tell you, pay attention to the bloodline. With Zoro, he clearly does not want that gravitational pull overshadowing the day-to-day writing of the character. So he threads the needle. He names the village Shimotsuki Village. He reveals in an SBS that Shimotsuki Kozaburo left Wano forged Wado and Enma, founded that village. He has Wano samurai stare at Zoro and go, "You feel familiar?" He mirrors Ryuma's scar on Zoro's face. Everything is screaming Shimotsuki without ever stamping it on a wanted poster. This is not a sin. This is not Oda being coy for no reason. This is smart storytelling. And there's a meta bonus. This ambiguity is content. It feeds the community. It lets fans turn into that pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast, except the toast is every panel where Zoro interacts with a samurai. We need to admit this is fine. This is normal. Leaving the door half open keeps Zoro's mystique alive and gives Oda maximum flexibility to tighten or loosen the bloodline details later without contradicting a dramatic in-story declaration. Which is why, if we ever get a confirmation, I would bet my entire manga shelf it shows up as a throwaway SBS line or a Vivre card box, not a tearful "My name is Shimotsuki Zoro" speech. That's exactly how Oda handled Kozaburo, the village, all of it. Dry, technical, almost boring delivery for lore that would have hijacked the main narrative. But that raises a tougher question. If Oda is this careful about the name, what does that say about the role he's written for Zoro in the endgame? To answer that, we need to stop staring at the family tree and look at the one thing Oda uses as Zoro's real birth certificate. His blades. So if Oda's treating swords as Zoro's real birth certificate, we need to do the boring thing nobody on the internet wants to do. Math. Timeline math. Listen to me. This is where most bloodline theories die, because the community runs on vibes and fan art, not calendars. Here's what we actually know. In SBS, Oda spells out that Shimotsuki Kozaburo left Wano 55 years ago, washed up in East Blue, and founded Shimotsuki Village. This is the same village where a certain green-haired menace grows up. Zoro is 21 post-time skip, 19 pre-time skip. Kuina is roughly Zoro's age when she dies, maybe a year older. Koshiro, her father and Zoro's teacher, visually reads as mid-30s in the flashbacks, which would put him mid-40s during the main story. None of this is airtight, but it's enough to start building a chain. So generationally, what does that look like? Kozaburo leaves Wano at, say, his early 20s. He arrives, helps some locals, founds a village, has kids. 20 years after arrival, he's in his 40s and could easily have a son. Koshiro. Another 20-ish years, Koshiro has Kuina. Another year or two, Zoro is born in the same village, either from a direct Shimotsuki line or a collateral branch that married in. The important part is the spacing. Roughly 20-year gaps, which is exactly the kind of broad strokes planning an author doing long-term storytelling would use. Here's the thing. There are gaps. Oda never drops exact ages for Kozaburo or Koshiro. He doesn't put a birth year on Kuina's grave. That's not a problem. That's the wiggle room. As long as nobody is forced to be a 12-year-old grandfather, the numbers hold. And here they do. Kozaburo being in his 70s or 80s by the time he forges Enma and Wado Ichimonji. This is fine. A swordsmith working into old age is normal. A village founder having kids later in life is normal. We need to compare this to series where the timeline absolutely collapses the second you touch it. You poke at Naruto's ages around the Third War, or Bleach's Soul Society flashbacks, and suddenly characters have to be in 3 places at once. That's when you know the author is retrofitting hard. In One Piece, the big date anchors, Void Century, Roger's execution 24 years ago, Ohara 22 years ago, Kozuki Toki's jumps, Kozaburo leaving Wano 55 years ago, form a grid. Not perfect, but consistent enough that when you drop Shimotsuki Village onto it, Zoro's presence there doesn't break anything. So no, we don't have a labelled family tree with arrows saying, "Zoro's dad here, please clap." But the absence of a PowerPoint slide doesn't mean the plan isn't there. The ages, the migrations, the generational spacing. They don't contradict the idea that Zoro is a Shimotsuki descendant. They quietly support it. And if the timeline isn't fighting this theory, the real question becomes, what are those swords actually saying about who he is? Because once you start reading Wano and Enma as a two-part signature, not just cool loot drops, the Bloodline argument stops being a fun coincidence game and turns into something much more dangerous for where Zoro's story is headed. And this is where the community quietly loses its mind. Because once you start seeing Wano and Enma as a two-part signature, the pattern-seeking monkey in your brain does not stop at Shimotsuki descendant. It goes, oh, Ryuma's scar. Oh, Dragon Slayer. Oh, Samurai Country. He's Ryuma reincarnated. Secret heir to Wano. Oda planned this in 1997. Case closed. And listen to me. That impulse, that's just your hardware. Humans are built to see faces in clouds and Jesus in toast. Anime fandom is that impulse with Photoshop and a Twitter account. So you get edits where every panel of Zoro standing with his sword on his shoulder has a red circle and an arrow. Same pose as Ryuma. You get threads where anytime someone says the word dragon within 3 meters of Zoro, it's treated as capital F foreshadowing. Kaido's a dragon? Ryuma slayed a dragon? Zoro cut a dragon once? Boom. Bloodline solved. Here's the thing. This is not a sin. This is not bad reading. This is normal. Pattern hunting is how you're supposed to engage with long-form storytelling. The problem is the moment you decide on the answer first. Once you lock in, Zoro is Ryuma reincarnated, or Zoro is the lost samurai prince of Wano, confirmation bias does the rest. Every ambiguous line becomes intentional, planned proof. Every design echo is a secret code. And anything that doesn't fit, you either don't see it, or you invent a lore patch to explain it away. Oda says in an SBS that Ryuma in Thriller Bark is the same Ryuma from Monsters. That becomes, see, spiritual cycle confirmed. Oda also says Zoro is from East Blue, from a village founded by a guy who left Wano 55 years ago. Suddenly that's just a cover story, or he was adopted because it doesn't serve the prince narrative. You're not reading the text anymore. You're defending your headcanon in court. Why does this matter? Because when we treat every parallel as 4D chess, we actually erase the real craft. Oda did not have a 900-chapter spreadsheet of Ryuma poses to mirror. He had a pre-written skeleton. Country of samurai, legendary swordsman, Shimotsuki diaspora. Then, as he went, he retrofitted earlier ideas. Thriller Bark Ryuma, dragon gags, cursed swords, to resonate with that skeleton. If you credit him with omniscient planning for every panel, you miss how good he is at pre-writing the big stuff and then cleverly stitching new and old material together. We need to separate "this feels cool and symbolic" from the author explicitly planned this from day one. Enjoy the red circles. Enjoy the Ryuma edits. This is fine. But I need you to be willing to update your theory when the actual text and Oda's own comments point toward the simpler category. Zoro, as a Shimotsuki descendant carrying inherited will, not a reincarnated demigod. Because if you can hold on to that more grounded version, the next set of patterns we're about to look at gets way more interesting and way more dangerous for what it says about where Oda is steering Zoro's endgame. So if we're going to argue for the boring, grounded, Shimotsuki diaspora version of Zoro, we need to do the unsexy thing. Actually read what Oda himself has said. Not vibes, not Twitter threads with red arrows. The author's words. Here's the thing. When you line up the SBS answers and interviews, Oda is not being coy about the broad strokes. In SBS Volume 96, he straight up spells out that Shimotsuki Kozaburo left Wano 55 years ago, drifted into East Blue, helped liberate a village from bandits, and that village became Shimotsuki Village. Same name as the Wano clan. Same guy who forged Wado Ichimonji and Enma. That is not subtle foreshadowing. That is a neon sign saying, Zoro's hometown is a Wano offshoot, and his core sword is literally from this man. He doubles down by stating that Kozaburo forged both Wado and Enma. So the sword Kuina used, the sword Zoro swore on, and the problem child sword that tests him in Wano all share a single origin point. One Wano samurai who defected and founded the village where Zoro grew up. The storytelling chain is clean. Wano to Kozaburo, to Shimotsuki village, to Koshiro/Kuina, to Zoro. You don't need metaphysics when the logistics are this carefully planned. And then there's the meta comment everyone forgets. In an SBS where a reader asks which country the Straw Hats would be from in real life, Oda answers that Zoro would be from Japan. At the time, Wano did not exist on the page as Japan country of samurai yet. But the author is already thematically stapling Zoro to Japanese swordsman. That's pre-writing. He knows there will be a Wano. He knows Zoro is spiritually from there. He's just not printing the surname on the cover yet. Now, contrast that with how he handles direct questions about Zoro's parents or full name. Over and over, readers poke, is Zoro a Shimotsuki? Who are his parents? And Oda either jokes, dodges, or gives a half answer that walks right up to the line and then stops. This is not a sin. This is not him having no idea. This is how he treats any card he's still holding for later payoff. He did the same thing with Sanji's family, with the Will of D, with Imu. Silence is a category of foreshadowing when you know the author is otherwise extremely chatty. Pattern interrupt. If Oda genuinely had nothing planned, he would have just said random orphan years ago and moved on. He has no problem deconfirming bad theories. So we need to separate text from projection. Explicitly confirmed, Kozaburo left Wano, founded Shimotsuki village, forged Wado and Enma, and Zoro is from that village and would be from Japan. Inferred by fans, exact parents, Ryuma reincarnation, secret daimyo prince, different evidentiary weight. One category is author-stated logistics. The other is us being pattern-seeking monkeys who see Jesus in toast every time two characters share a chin. When you restrict yourself to Oda's own words plus what's on the page, the conservative conclusion is still very strong. Zoro is a child of the Shimotsuki diaspora, shaped by a Wano offshoot, carrying swords and styles that trace directly back to that clan. Not a random orphan, not a clone, a planned export. And if that's the baseline, then the question shifts from, is he a Shimotsuki, to what kind of story do you tell when your swordsman is literally Wano's ghost walking around the world? So when you call Zoro Wano's ghost walking around the world, you can't dodge the most haunted object attached to him, Shusui. I need you to remember how weird that sword's journey actually is, because it's our cleanest window into how Oda patches an old decision to fit a newer, sharper plan. Shusui starts as pure trophy. Thriller bark. Ryuma's corpse. You beat me, take my national treasure. Boom. New black blade for the green guy. No paperwork. No customs. The author just hands the deuteragonist a legendary sword and walks away. At that point in the story, Wano is a rumor. Ryuma is a cool one-shot callback. And Shusui is essentially a power-up cosplay of a legend with no visible strings attached. Then we hit Wano, and suddenly the bill comes due. The moment the country realizes Shusui is gone, the mood flips. Graves were robbed. A god of the blade was desecrated. The community treats it as sacrilege, not a quirky missing heirloom. You don't get rage, you get violation. And because this is a closed border nation with weapon politics baked into its trauma, that one missing sword becomes a diplomatic incident waiting to happen. Shusui stops being Zoro's strongest sword and turns into a stolen cultural artifact he's been swinging around on world tour. Here's the thing, that's not just flavor. That's Oda reframing the object. The narrative starts screaming at you that Shusui is too big to be personal. It belongs to Wano's mythos first and Zoro second. So what do you do when your protagonist is carrying a symbol that, by the new rules of the story, really shouldn't leave the country ever again? Oda's solution is elegant and suspiciously convenient. Zoro returns Shusui, and in exchange he gets Enma. On paper it's a trade. In practice, it's a surgical rewrite. He gives back a borrowed legend and receives a blade that is both Wano's and, crucially, his. Enma is forged by Shimotsuki Kozaburo, the same man who made Wado Ichimonji, the same man who left Wano, founded Zoro's village, and basically smuggled the Shimotsuki bloodline into East Blue. That's not a random swap. That's realignment. This is where we need to be honest about categories. Shusui being handed to Zoro in Thriller Bark reads very retrofit once Wano is fleshed out. This is not a sin. This is normal serialized writing. You give your swordsman a cool toy, then 10 years later you realize, oh, this toy conflicts with the national treasure geopolitics I just invented, and you have to write a law-consistent recall. The return and trade sequence is the patch note, but notice what the patch does. After the swap, every one of Zoro's important blades is now stamped Shimotsuki, Wado from his childhood. Enma as Wado's sister sword, both made by the founder of his village. Suddenly the swords don't just come from Wano, they come from his clan's exodus. The randomness drains out, and the bloodline story tightens. Listen to me. That's the author telling you Zoro isn't meant to carry any Wano blade. He's meant to carry these blades. Which raises a much nastier question than, is he related to Ryuma? Because if the swords are this intentional, what exactly were they forged to do? So when we hit Zoro versus King, that what were these swords forged to do? Question stops being hypothetical and starts throwing punches. This is the moment where the bloodline theory thread and the ambition thread stop running in parallel and finally collide on screen. And Oda does it in the most on-brand way possible. Not with a family tree chart, but with Zoro getting folded while his sword actively tries to kill him. The early beats of that fight are Zoro losing. He can't read King's gimmick, he's burning stamina, and Enma is overdrawing his haki to the point his arm looks mummified. The problem is not, is Zoro strong enough? The problem is, can Zoro actually control the Shimotsuki inheritance he's been handed? Every time he tries to clamp down on Enma, it rebels. Every time he lets it run wild, it nearly empties the tank. It's the most literal dramatization of, are you worthy of this legacy, the series has ever done. And then Oda hits the pattern interrupt. The Kozaburo flashbacks. We jump back to that old man in Shimotsuki village, talking about how swords are not tools for killing, they are tools for protecting. About how a good sword is one that cuts what you want. Nothing more, nothing less. Listen to me. This is not random nostalgia. This is pre-writing cashing out. The author planted Kozaburo, Wado, and that philosophy decades ago, and now he drags it into the ring at the exact second Zoro needs a new mental model to survive. Here's the thing. Zoro's breakthrough is not, I need more haki. It's, I need to stop treating Enma as cursed and start aligning my will with it. When he remembers Kozaburo naming Enma, when he realizes this is the twin to Wado Ichimonji, he reframes the whole category of dangerous swords. They're not evil, they're honest. They demand a user whose ambition is big enough to justify that level of hunger. King of Hell isn't an edgy title, it's a job description. The man whose will is so overbearing that even a demon blade relaxes. Visually, Oda is screaming Ryuma echo at you without writing it in the margins. A lone swordsman, scarred in the same place, standing over a burning nation, cutting down a masked flying monster whose very existence feels mythological. The Lunarian with fire wings is just the Wano-era dragon problem in a new skin. Zoro's final combo on King is a direct spiritual sequel to Ryuma cutting a dragon over Wano. The community's pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast instincts are actually correct here, and for once this is fine. But we need to be clear, this is not about proving his bloodline in a spreadsheet sense. Nobody stops mid-fight to announce, "You are Shimotsuki Zoro." What gets proven is that he deserves whatever that name would entail. He earns his place in Wano's history by defending its future, by mastering Enma through Kozaburo's creed, not by flashing a daimyo ID card. This is not a sin. This is Oda refusing the easy royal twist in favor of merit. When Zoro declares himself the king of hell and drops king from the sky, that's 20 plus years of samurai coding, Kozaburo hints, and Ryuma parallels converging into one coherent statement about who he is in this world. The swords, the village, the legend, they all snap into focus. And the terrifying part, which we need to talk about next, is what that implies about the role Oda has planned for him beyond Wano. So when Zoro calls himself the King of Hell and Wano literally frames him against Ryuma's silhouette, that's not just cool poster art. That's Oda quietly telling you, hey, this bloodline thing, this is infrastructure. Here's the thing. Zoro being Shimotsuki isn't a trivia answer for a Vivre card. It's the wiring that lets Oda plug East Blue, the New World, and a centuries-old samurai myth into one continuous circuit. Think about the geography of this. You start in weak East Blue in a random village named Shimotsuki, founded 55 years ago by Shimotsuki Kozaburo, a Wano samurai who forges Wado Ichimonji there and Enma back home. That's not a cute coincidence. That is intentional pre-writing. The author plants a village and a sword in Chapter 1 territory so that, 1,000 chapters later, he can fold Wano's closed-off history directly into Luffy's origin sea without having to invent a portal or a prophecy. Zoro's personal trajectory is the same maneuver on the character level. He begins as a no-name bounty hunter tied to a dojo master who just happens to have Wano naming conventions, a Wano sword, and a Wano-style philosophy about the blade's will. Then he sails across half the planet and ends up being treated in Wano as Ryuma's spiritual successor, the guy who slays a dragon over the flower capital and returns Shusui's honor. That's inherited will as a literal travel itinerary. The will leaves Wano with Kozaburo, incubates in East Blue with Zoro, then sails back across the ocean to finish Ryuma's unfinished job. And I need you to notice how that reframes Wano's liberation emotionally. Zoro isn't just helping Luffy free some country with cool katanas. He's defending the homeland of the man who founded his village, forged his childhood sword, and effectively raised his entire value system. When he bows to Hiyori to return Shusui, that's not a random swordsman respecting a foreign princess. That's a grandson returning a family heirloom to the graveyard it was stolen from. The community impact and the personal impact are the same event. Pattern interrupt. This is where people start screaming, "Secret Prince," or "Ryuma reincarnation," because our brains are pattern-seeking monkeys who see Jesus in toast. But this is not a sin. This is normal. Oda is not giving you royal blood wish fulfillment. He's doing something way more structurally useful, tying Zoro to a clan with reach across seas, without saddling him with daimyo politics that would hijack his role in the story. Now put him next to Luffy. Luffy, as a D, is the storm. He shows up, breaks heavenly dragons, topples tyrants, flips the table on whatever oppressive system is in charge. Zoro, as Shimotsuki-tied swordsman, is the aftermath. He restores shrines, returns blades, re-establishes the protector figure that countries tell stories about for the next 400 years. One embodies the world historical current of liberation. The other embodies the world historical current of guardianship and honor. So when you clock the Shimotsuki heritage, you stop reading Wano as cool samurai cosplay arc and start seeing the scaffolding of Oda's long-term construction. The foreshadowing around Zoro isn't just who is his dad, it's what kind of force is he in history, which is exactly where we need to go next when we talk about the endgame. So now that we've upgraded Zoro from green murder machine to historical force, we need to do the boring but essential thing: paperwork. We need to actually file every major Zoro clue into the right category, so you stop treating every panel as evidence that Oda is a time-traveling god. Quick mental list. Shimotsuki Village, Koshiro and Kuina's dojo, Wado Ichimonji, Ryuma in Thriller Bark, Shusui, the Kozaburo SBS bomb, Enma choosing Zoro, Wano people freaking out, the graveyard in Ringo. Those are the big pillars. Now we ask, for each one, pre-writing, foreshadowing, or retrofit? Shimotsuki Village is pure pre-writing that later masquerades as foreshadowing. Oda slaps the name Shimotsuki on Zoro's hometown absurdly early. At that point, Country of Samurai exists in his notes, Wano exists in his notes, but the exact daimyo family chart? Almost certainly not. The name is a floating anchor. Once Wano is fully defined, that anchor retroactively becomes, wow, he planned this for 20 years. He did plan the connection. He did not necessarily pre-draw a Shimotsuki genealogy PowerPoint in 1997. Koshiro, Kuina, and the dojo sit in the same bucket. The aesthetic is Wano-coded from day one. The sword style, the kimono, the entire atmosphere screams, this is a satellite of some closed-off samurai nation. That's pre-writing. The specific detail that Koshiro is Shimotsuki Kushiru, cousin to a Wano daimyo. That's a later retrofit that snaps the aesthetic into a concrete family. Wado Ichimonji is where we start shading into actual foreshadowing. A named white katana heirloom from Zoro's dead rival, treated as sacred, with no immediate payoff. That is an author intentionally planting an artifact he knows he's going to cash out. When the Kozaburo SBS drops and reveals Wado and Enma share a maker who left Wano to found Shimotsuki Village, that's retrofitting used as a weld. It locks the pre-written mysterious sword into the Wano infrastructure. Ryuma, Shusui, and Thriller Bark are the prototype reveal. Ryuma's design, the scar, the samurai from a country of swordsmen, the gift of Shusui to Zoro. This is pre-writing and foreshadowing braided together. Oda clearly already has the Ryuma short story and Wano concept in his pocket, so he can intentionally mirror Zoro to Ryuma, but the exact descendant of Shimotsuki label is left deliciously vague until later. Enma is different. Enma choosing Zoro, Hiyori's reaction, Kawamatsu staring at him like he's seen a ghost. That's planned payoff. By the time we hit Wano, the Shimotsuki framework is solid. These scenes are not improvisations. They're the gun finally going off. Here's the thing. This hybrid method is why the community keeps overcorrecting into Oda planned everything from Chapter 1 brain rot. He pre-writes names and artifacts, retrofits them into specific clans when the arc crystallizes, then deploys clean foreshadowing payoffs right before impact. To our pattern-seeking monkey brains, it feels omniscient. And this is not a sin. This is not cheating. This is in fact what his genius actually is, building flexible scaffolding he can later bend into thematically perfect shapes. The question is, what happens when that scaffolding points past Wano into Zoro's role in the literal end of the world? So when you see a panel of Kid Zoro in Shimotsuki Village and a panel of adult Zoro in Wano and go, Oda planned this from Chapter 1, peak foreshadowing, I need you to slow down. I need you to actually hear what you're saying there, because buried under the praise is a really weird insult. Here's the thing. The community has turned Oda planned everything from day one into a religious mantra. Every twist, every bloodline, every reveal. Preordained. Written on stone tablets in 1997. And if you question that, you're apparently disrespecting the author. But that mindset quietly implies that the only impressive category of writing is a giant static blueprint, not the actual decades-long craft of solving problems in real time. You're basically saying Oda is a genius because he stopped being a writer the second he started serialization. No adaptation, no course correction, no new ideas, just a 100-volume PDF he's been slowly printing out. That's not how storytelling works. That's not how human brains work. That's not even how Oda describes his own process. Take Zoro. Yes, his Wano connection is intentional. Shimotsuki village shares the clan name. His teacher is Kushiru. His rival is Kuina. Their sword style and aesthetic scream samurai country. Thriller Bark hands him Ryuma's body and literally puts a dragon-slaying legend in his silhouette. That's not random. That's scaffolding. But do you really think Oda had Shimotsuki Kozaburo left Wano 55 years ago, forged Wado Ichimonji and Enma, founded Zoro's hometown, and one day Enma will choose Zoro in Act 2 of Wano, written in a notebook before Chapter 1? Or did he have a softer, fuzzier intention? This swordsman is from a village with secret ties to a closed-off samurai nation. I'll cash that in when I finally open that country up. Listen to me. The end result feels inevitable, not because it was a one-to-one blueprint, but because he's absurdly good at retrofitting. He takes old seeds, Shimotsuki, Ryuma's corpse, a white sword named Wado, and folds new decisions into them so cleanly that our pattern-seeking monkey brains, the same ones that see Jesus in toast, retroactively swear it had to be that way. Oda confirming in an SBS that Kozaburo left Wano, forged both Wado and Enma, and founded Zoro's village. That's retrofitting done at God tier. He's stitching a coherent bloodline out of hints that originally just said, this guy is from a sword-obsessed backwater with mysterious traditions. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is, in fact, the job. And when Wano characters react to Zoro as if he's carrying Shimotsuki history on his back, that's the payoff of a mix, some pre-written intent, some evolving ideas, some ruthless retrofitting. Appreciating that blend is way more awe-inspiring than pretending Oda pressed export full series in 1997. We need to drop the perfect plan myth. Not because Oda isn't that good, but because he's better. The real flex isn't predicting everything. It's making 25 plus years of shifting decisions feel predestined. So the question isn't, did he plan Zoro's bloodline from Chapter 1? The question is, what does he gain by making Zoro Shimotsuki now, at this exact stage of the endgame? So what does Oda actually gain by doing this now? He's not just ticking a trivia box. He's finally answering the question the community has been screaming into the void for 20 years. Who is Zoro, really? First, we need to clear the junk off the table. Zoro is not Ryuma reincarnated. He's not some ghost spawn who crawled out of Thriller Bark with a bonus soul DLC. He's also not a secret Wano prince, not a lost daimyo heir, not the guy who's going to sit on a throne and argue tax policy. But he's also not a random nobody who just happened to grow up in a village that accidentally shares a name with a Wano clan and accidentally uses Wano sword forms. That category doesn't exist in writing this intentional. Here's the thing. Oda told you what Zoro is. He just waited decades to put the label on. Zoro is a Shimotsuki descendant. Period. He's the product of Kozaburo's planned exile, born into a village literally built from Wano's sword culture, swinging a blade forged by the same man who created Enma. Wado Ichimonji is not just a keepsake from Kuina. It's bloodline foreshadowing you've been staring at since East Blue. And then Enma chooses him. Not because swords are romantically dramatic, but because in this story, blades are history on steel. Kozaburo forges Wado and Enma, sends one to East Blue, leaves one in Wano, and decades later they both end up in the hands of the same guy. That's not coincidence. That's the author pulling the trigger on a setup he parked in Act 1. So Zoro is not Ryuma's reincarnation. He's worse. He's the answer to Ryuma's unfinished will. Ryuma was the god of the blade in a closed-off country that only knew how to protect itself. Zoro is the next generation swordsman carrying that myth into a globalized nightmare where celestial dragons, ancient weapons and emperors are all on the board. He's not copying Ryuma's legend. He's updating the software for a world with far more things to cut. Pattern interrupt. I need you to stop thinking in royalty terms. Is he a prince? Is the wrong question. His true title isn't royal, it's functional. He is being positioned as the world's next great protector swordsman. The Guy nations will tell stories about the way Wano tells stories about Ryuma. The man who shows up when a dragon, a god, or a tyrant needs to be removed from the narrative. And that role? That's more dangerous than royalty. Kings can be dethroned. Bloodlines can be snuffed out. But a myth backed by inherited will and centuries of planned storytelling momentum is almost impossible to kill. Which means the real tension going forward isn't will Zoro claim a throne? It's what happens to the world when a Shimotsuki carrying Ryuma's shadow decides what deserves to be cut. So now take that question. What happens when a Shimotsuki carrying Ryuma's shadow decides what deserves to be cut? And rewind all the way back to episode 1. Or, more precisely, episode 2, Shellstown. Because suddenly that guy tied to the post isn't just a scary bounty hunter doing an intimidation speedrun. He's a lost samurai heir from a hidden Wano offshoot village who doesn't even know his own surname category yet. I need you to mentally replay that courtyard. The Marines think they've captured a monster. The townspeople think they're watching a public execution. You, on first watch, think, oh, this is the edgy swordsman. But if you've internalized the Shimotsuki reveal, you're watching a different tension. You're watching the world accidentally crucify a relic of Wano's golden age, a guy whose entire sword ethic was planned in a closed country he's never set foot in. Same scene, different axis of dread. And then the dojo flashbacks. Those are no longer generic training arc cutaways the author tossed in because Shunin law required one childhood trauma per crewmate. Here's the thing, once you know Shimotsuki Kozaburo sailed out of Wano, founded Shimotsuki village, and forged Wado Ichimonji and Enma, that sleepy East Blue dojo turns into a smuggled Wano embassy. Koshiro isn't just stern teacher with glasses. He's the caretaker of a fugitive sword tradition, doing low-budget cultural preservation in the booniest sea. Listen to me. When you rewatch Zoro and Kuina clashing wooden swords in that tiny hall, you're not just seeing rivals. You're seeing the last kids in a dying curriculum, inheriting kata and philosophy that were supposed to stay behind Wano's borders. Every line about the breath of all things stops being a cool metaphor and starts reading as contraband doctrine, slipped past the world government under the guise of local dojo. Now track Wado Ichimonji. That sword is in every major Zoro fight. Alvida, Mihawk, Mr. One, Eni's Lobby, Thriller Bark, Sabaudi, all of it. On first watch, it's just his important katana with a tragic backstory. This is normal. This is fine. But once you plug in Kozaburo's identity, Wado stops being a prop and becomes a ghost on his hip. It's Kozaburo's will, literally forged steel, watching his descendants stumble back toward Wano, only to be traded for Enma in the most on-the-nose foreshadowing payoff Oda has ever done. We need to talk about the dream too. Every time Zoro says world's greatest swordsman or references his promise to Kuina, that's not just personal ambition. That's a fragment of a much older mission statement, a will chain that runs from Ryuma's legend, through Kozaburo's exile, through Kuina's frustration, into this green-haired disaster who gets lost walking in a straight line. You can almost feel the community of dead Shimotsuki screaming, "This is the one we bet on." And no, This perspective doesn't overwrite your original reading. It stacks on top of it. The scary bounty hunter, the loyal first mate, the stubborn rival to Sanji, all still there. The difference is that now you can see the author's intentional scaffolding under the surface, the pre-written bloodline logic that turns coincidence into design. The problem is once you see that scaffolding for Zoro, you start asking a much more dangerous question. Who else has been hiding an endgame surname in plain sight from Chapter 1? So here's where the community completely loses the plot. You see that scaffolding for Zoro, and suddenly every panel from Chapter 1 becomes crazy 4D foreshadowing. I need you to stop doing that. Not because it's evil, but because it turns every conversation into two pattern-seeking monkeys arguing about who saw Jesus in toast first. Here's the thing. We don't actually need new brain cells to fix this. We just need better words. Instead of screaming, Oda planned this 25 years ago at every coincidence, start asking, is this an early hint, a later connection, or an author confirmation? 3 buckets. That's it. Early hint means the detail is on the page before the payoff and plausibly intentional. Later connection means the cool link only exists once a newer scene reframes it. Author confirmation is when Oda literally tells you in an SBS or data book what he meant. Take Shimotsuki Village. That name is not retrofitting. That's pre-writing. Oda labels Zoro's hometown with a Wano daimyo surname before Wano even exists as an arc. That's an early hint deployed in service of a pre-written bloodline idea. When we later get the SBS, where Oda explains Shimotsuki Kozaburo left Wano, founded that village, and forged Wado and Enma, that's not more foreshadowing. That's author confirmation stapling the whole category shut. Now compare that to the Kozaburo reveal itself. The old guy training Kid Zoro was always there, but his full identity as a Wano swordsmith, the Enma connection, the 55 years ago migration timeline. That's retrofitting. Oda goes back to an existing mentor figure and loads him with new planned significance to pay off the Shimotsuki label. This is not a sin. This is normal. This is how long-form storytelling survives 25 years without collapsing under its own law. Enma choosing Zoro in Wano is the payoff. That's the moment where all 3 categories collide. You've got the pre-writing. Zoro needs to be a Shimotsuki descendant. The early hint, the village name, Wado's origin. The retrofit, Kozaburo's upgraded backstory. And then the sword literally resonating with him in front of Wano samurai who go, huh, this guy feels familiar. You don't have to scream bloodline foreshadowing at that scene. You can say, this is the planned payoff of a pre-written bloodline thread. And when you're theorizing, I need you to start labeling your own takes. Say, this is probably pre-writing that could go X or Y direction, instead of Oda confirmed Zoro is secret shogun Prince Cope. You immediately lower the temperature of the argument, because you're admitting which category you're playing in and how certain you actually are. This precision doesn't kill the fun, it upgrades the game. Now you're not worshipping a mythical 25-year spreadsheet, you're reverse engineering a real human author's process. And once you start doing that for Zoro, you're going to notice other characters whose coincidences start looking suspiciously structural. Beyond Zoro, applying this framework to other One Piece mysteries. Once you see that with Zoro, you can't unsee it. Your brain starts speedrunning the rest of One Piece's mystery board and going, okay, who else is hiding a 20-year spreadsheet under their bandana? And the answer is, a lot of them. Take Luffy. The Will of D is the most obvious case where foreshadowing, retrofitting, and pre-writing are stapled together into one cursed family tree. The D initial is on page 1 of the story's mythology. That's pre-writing. Oda clearly planned, there is a secret clan that matters to the Void Century, before he drew a single straw hat. But then you get things the author clearly added later. Specific Ds, specific roles, specific Void Century flashbacks. That's retrofitting, not divine prophecy. Or Sanji, because he's the cleanest example of how these categories can coexist and still feel coherent. Early on, you have his weird bounty poster, the Mr. Prince persona, the North Blue origin that doesn't match where the Baratie is. Those are intentional setups. They only make sense if Oda already knew this guy is secretly from a notorious royal murder power Rangers family. At the same time, Germa 66 as a full sci-fi Nazi raid squad with snails and battlesuits. That lore dump smells way more added once the series was huge than etched in stone in 1997. This is not a sin. This is fine. This is normal. Here's the thing. Sanji's noble manners, his obsession with feeding the hungry, his refusal to kick people with his hands because those are for cooking. All of that pre-Vinsmoke characterization becomes retroactive proof that the reveal was planned. You don't accidentally build a chivalrous, courtly chef who happens to slot perfectly into runaway, genetically engineered prince. You pre-write the spine, you retrofit the costume, and the foreshadowing is the connective tissue that makes fans go, of course it was Germa. Now zoom out to Blackbeard's cursed biology, Immu's existence, and the Void Century. We need to stop treating every reused moon symbol as a religious vision and start asking, which parts were locked in and which parts were opportunistic? Blackbeard having a weird body that can hold multiple fruits feels pre-written. He doesn't sleep, the Jolly Roger with 3 skulls, the way Whitebeard frames him. The exact mechanics of Yami and Gura, the way his crew's powers mirror the worst generation, that's probably retrofitting around a core idea. Pattern interrupt. This doesn't debunk the magic. It demystifies the method. And for some of you, that's actually more satisfying. You're not worshipping a chaos god. You're watching a very tired man meticulously juggle 3 categories of information for 25 years. So listen to me. You can use this. I need you to stop being just a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast every time 2 panels rhyme and start asking, what did Oda almost certainly know before chapter 1? What did he bolt on once the story proved it could carry that weight? Apply it to Immu. Apply it to the ancient weapons. Apply it to every Bloodline question that hits your feed. Because once you do that, you're not just consuming theories. You're co-analyzing the author's process. You're grading the craftsmanship instead of worshipping the coincidence. And that mindset is crucial for where we're going next, because the Zoro case actually exposes a deeper, uncomfortable truth about how we, as a community, talk about genius in long-running manga. So this is where a bunch of you lean back and go, okay, but what if Oda just drops some insane SBS tomorrow and none of this matters? And listen to me, that anxiety is fair. You are reading an ongoing story written by a man who treats author comments like flashbang grenades. Here's the thing, Oda absolutely can complicate this. He can wake up, answer a random SBS, and go, oh, by the way, here's Zoro's grandma's maiden name, and suddenly the community is doing red string conspiracy boards again. This is normal. This is how serialized storytelling works. New information arrives, old information gets recontextualized, and everyone on Twitter forgets what they said 3 years ago. But that doesn't mean the current analysis is fake or useless. Our framework is about how the story functions right now, with what the author has actually put on the page. We are not claiming to have hacked Oda's Google Drive. We're saying, given Shimotsuki Village, given Kozaburo leaving Wano 55 years ago, forging Wado Ichimonji and Enma, given Wano's reaction to Zoro and the Ryuma parallels, the most intentional, least fan fiction category to put Zoro in is Shimotsuki descendant. Could Oda refine that? Sure. He could say Zoro's mum was from another region, or that a specific branch of the clan did something wild. This is fine. Refinement is not erasure. If tomorrow he reveals the exact family tree, that doesn't retroactively make the existing foreshadowing disappear. It just snaps it into higher resolution. What he cannot do, without breaking his own scaffolding, is suddenly announce, "Surprise, Zoro is secretly from Skypiea." That would collide head-on with Shimotsuki village sharing the clan name of a Wano daimyo family, with Kozaburo explicitly founding that village, with Enma and Wado being sister blades from Wano's greatest smith. At some point, the planned infrastructure of the story boxes the author in. Not because he lacks freedom, but because he's already spent narrative capital in a specific direction. And we need to talk about that investment. The more Oda has poured into the Shimotsuki/Wano pipeline, the village name, Kuina and Koshiru's aesthetics, the Ryuma scar mirroring Zoro's, the way Wano characters keep going, you feel familiar, the less plausible it is that he's going to hard pivot into some unrelated twist. That would not be clever foreshadowing. That would be a bait and switch on his own pre-writing. I need you to notice what we're actually doing here. We're not declaring eternal canon from a throne of certainty. We're doing versioned analysis. Theory 1.0, Zoro is a Shimotsuki descendant, constructed from the best available evidence. If Oda drops new data, we patch to 1.1. Updating isn't weakness. It's what separates serious analysis from me just writing fan fiction, where Zoro is a time-traveling Lunarian cyborg because my pattern-seeking monkey brain thinks his earrings are suspicious. And here's the uncomfortable twist. Once you accept that, you're forced to confront what Oda has already locked in about Zoro's role in the endgame, which is where this gets much scarier than who's his dad. So let's rewind the whole thing, so you can actually win arguments with evidence instead of screaming, "He's Ryuma 2.0" in all caps. Here's the claim in one sentence. Zoro is best understood as a Shimotsuki descendant from a Wano-founded village, carrying the inherited will of Ryuma and Kozaburo. Not a reincarnated ghost. Not a secret samurai prince. A planned, grounded bloodline payoff that ties his entire story together without turning him into Isekai Jesus. To get there, we built a framework. Foreshadowing, retrofitting, pre-writing. Foreshadowing is the intentional stuff. Enma choosing Zoro, Wano citizens reacting to him, the way his aura gets framed next to Ryuma's. Retrofitting is Oda going back and assigning new meaning. The SBS, where he suddenly tells you, "Oh yeah, Shimotsuki Kozaburo left Wano 55 years ago, founded Shimotsuki village, forged Wado and Enma." Pre-writing is the scary part. Details that were baked in from chapter 1, then left sitting there for decades. Shimotsuki village is the pre-writing smoking gun. Zoro's hometown literally shares its name with a Wano daimyo clan. That's not a coincidence. That's an author quietly labeling the map in advance. Then you add Kozaburo, the guy who forged Wado Ichimonji. The sword Zoro gets in chapter 3 is the same guy who forged Enma, the sword that chooses him in Wano. The village founder, the swordsmith, the clan name, all in one line. This is intentional structure, not fan fiction. Then there's Ryuma. Thriller Bark is Oda running a prototype reveal. Zoro meets the sword god of Wano, who shares his scar placement, his silhouette, his whole Dragon Slayer legend. Ryuma respects him and literally hands over Shusui, the national treasure. Years later, Wano characters see Zoro, see his sword style, see Shusui and Enma, and their reactions are, "You feel familiar," not, "Wow, the prince has returned." That's bloodline foreshadowing, not royalty cosplay. The graveyard and timeline clean this up. Kozaburo leaves Wano 55 years ago, founds Shimotsuki village, has descendants. Kuina's grave, Koshiro's Wano aesthetics, the school of swordsmanship Zoro inherits as a kid. All of that lines up with Zoro being from that branch family, not some random East Blue orphan who rolled god-tier swords on a gacha pool. So why am I bullying reincarnation and prince theories so hard? Because they break how One Piece handles will and royalty. In this story, inherited will is spiritual and ideological. The D people aren't reincarnations, they're successors. Royalty is treated as a burden or a joke. Making Zoro a literal Ryuma respawn or a hidden daimyo heir turns a clean planned payoff into a soap opera twist the author has never actually endorsed. Listen to me. This is not a sin to enjoy as headcanon. This is fine. This is normal pattern-seeking monkey brain behavior. The problem is when the community starts treating those theories as more genius than what Oda actually wrote. So here's the thing. I need you to treat this recap as your toolkit. Shimotsuki village name, Kozaburo founding it and forging Wado and Enma, Ryuma's respect and Shusui, Wano's reactions, the graveyard and the 55-year timeline. When someone goes, he's clearly a reincarnated prince, you can calmly say, or, hear me out, he's the Shimotsuki descendant Oda already confirmed. And if they want receipts, you send them to the full breakdown, where we pull every panel and every SBS and really stress test this theory against Oda's actual writing. Because the real question isn't who's his dad, it's why the author needed Zoro to be a Shimotsuki for the endgame. And that's where we're heading next. So when you zoom out from the who's his dad drama and just stare at the Zoro file, it turns into a case study for how Oda actually works. Not the mythical 25-year spreadsheet with every panel pre-planned, but the real, messy, terrifyingly efficient process of a human author trying to land a plane he started flying in the 90s. Here's the thing. Zoro's bloodline is not a single clean foreshadowing thread. It's a stack of different categories layered on top of each other over decades. Early on, you get the samurai coding and the broad pre-writing. Swordsman from Shimotsuki village, carries Wado Ichimonji, has a teacher who feels suspiciously important, duels in front of a grave. That's not random. That's Oda saying, I know this guy's tied to a samurai country. I know this sword matters. I just haven't opened the Wano folder yet. Then, years later, he goes back and retrofits. Shimotsuki Kozaburo is suddenly from Wano. The SBS quietly stitches Shimotsuki village into Wano's diaspora. Wado and Enma get the same origin. That's not him pulling a rabbit from a hat. That's him planting a rabbit in chapter 5 and deciding in chapter 900 what species it actually is. This is not a sin. This is normal. Most long-term storytelling lives right there in that flexible space between I planned this and I can still change my mind. And then you get the clean payoffs. Enma choosing Zoro. Kawamatsu and Hiyori reacting to him as if he smells Wano. The Ryuma parallels finally being acknowledged instead of just being a pattern-seeking monkey hallucination from the community. Those beats read intentional because by that point they are intentional. He has locked in the interpretation of seeds he scattered years ago. So no, Oda is not a pure improviser, just vibing from week to week. The consistency on Void Century, Will of D, Ancient Weapons, all that, proves there is core pre-writing. But he is also not a rigid planner chained to a sacred document. He's a gardener. He plants a forest of seedlings, Shimotsuki names, mysterious swords, throwaway SBS comments. And then, when the story needs a specific tree, he prunes, grafts and reshapes until that seed grows into a Shimotsuki family tree or a Wano legend. Pattern interrupt. This is actually good news. If he were fully locked into a 1997 outline, Wano would be a museum exhibit, not a story that could respond to 20 years of fan obsession with Zoro and Ryuma. I need you to understand why this hybrid approach is ideal for a decades-long manga. It lets him deliver those big, satisfying, oh my god, it was there the whole time connections without being trapped by teenage Oda's worst ideas or blind to what the fans latch onto. He can course correct, upgrade, or even retire setups that no longer serve the endgame. And that shifts how you admire him. We need to retire the fantasy of the divine spreadsheet and start respecting the ongoing craft, the week-by-week problem-solving, The restraint not to over-explain Zoro too early, the courage to retrofit openly in SBS instead of pretending it was all destined. Once you see that, you don't just become a better One Piece fan. You become a sharper reader, writer, critic. You start asking, what seeds are being planted here? And which ones are still flexible? And that question is exactly where we need to go next, when we talk about why Oda needed Zoro to be a Shimotsuki specifically for the final act. So here's where I need you to upgrade your operating system as a One Piece reader. We've walked through the receipts. We've separated foreshadowing from Oda saw a cool fan theory on 2CH. So now you need a clean default sentence you can actually use in arguments without turning into a conspiracy meme. Here's the thing. Your new baseline take is this. Zoro is from Shimotsuki village, founded by a Wano samurai who forged his swords. He's almost certainly a Shimotsuki descendant and the spiritual heir to Ryuma. But Oda intentionally keeps the exact family tree vague. That's it. That's the tweet. Everything else is optional DLC. Notice what that sentence does. It starts concrete. Shimotsuki village is on the map. Oda literally wrote, Shimotsuki Kozaburo left Wano 55 years ago, founded a village, forged Wado Ichimonji and Enma in SBS. Not in a dream you had at 3 AM after binge reading. Zoro grows up there. He inherits Wado. Enma later chooses him in Wano. That is not a coincidence category. That is intentional planned storytelling from an author who loves his paper trails. Only after you've laid that foundation do you move into the softer stuff. Almost certainly a Shimotsuki descendant. Spiritual heir to Ryuma. Those are inferences. Strong inferences. The story strongly implies them. Wano characters reacting to Zoro as if he's familiar. The shared scar placement with Ryuma. The dragon-slaying parallel. The way Thriller Bark retroactively reads as a prototype reveal. You'd have to bend over backwards harder than a gum-gum contortionist to avoid that reading. But listen to me. We need to keep this in the hypothesis category, not the religious doctrine category. You do not need to say, Oda confirmed Zoro is Ryuma's great-grandnephew twice removed. He didn't. What you say is, the most consistent reading is that Zoro is a Shimotsuki descendant and narrative successor to Ryuma. That wording matters. That's the difference between being a sharp reader and being a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast every time Oda draws a cross. This is not a sin. Being precise about what's text and what's inference does not make you less of a fan. This is normal. This is how you become the person the community quietly starts citing. You say, Oda confirmed Kozaburo and the village. The Ryuma connection is very heavily foreshadowed, but the exact family chart is still flexible unless he pins it down. You keep your verbs honest, and when you're in a discussion, lead with the receipts. Village name, Kozaburo, Wado and Enma, Wano reactions. Then, only then, you pivot to inherited will, to Ryuma parallels, to why Oda needed a Shimotsuki in the crew for the final act. Because the real payoff here isn't just who Zoro is, it's what that bloodline is for in the endgame, and that's where things get dangerous. Because now, I need you to zoom out and remember where we started this whole mess. 2 hours ago, I was yelling about people posting split screenshots of Zoro in Orangetown and Zoro in Wano going, see? Oda planned everything from chapter 1. As if that sentence is a magic spell that makes all critical thought evaporate. That was the problem. That was the thing I said meant we, as a community, had kind of lost the plot. And then you stayed. You didn't just hit retweet on a cropped panel and call it foreshadowing. You sat through pre-writing, through retrofitting, through the difference between a planned Shimotsuki village and a post hoc Ryuma parallel. You watched me turn into a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast, and then watched me throw half of those patterns out because the author intent wasn't there. So yes, I'm going to roast you for a second. You have spent an absolutely embarrassing amount of your finite human lifespan thinking about who Zoro's dad is. You have argued about whether he's Ryuma reincarnated, a secret daimyo prince, or just some guy with insane core strength. On paper, this is ridiculous. This is not normal adult behavior. Except here's the thing. This is not a sin. This is, in fact, the exact kind of not normal Oda is writing for. When you care this much about Zoro's bloodline, what you're really doing is caring about writing, about how legacies are constructed, about why a sword from a tiny East Blue dojo and a sword from Wano share a maker and a clan name. You're asking what the story is doing, structurally, not just who can beat who in a deathmatch. And I need you to keep that energy, not just for Zoro. The next time you see a panel that feels suspicious, do not stop at wow, crazy foreshadowing. Ask, is this pre-writing? Is this a retrofit? Is this Oda setting up a time bomb or cashing one in? Is this an intentional category of clue or just a thematic echo we're overfitting because we're starved for answers? Don't just screenshot Gear 5 panels for clout. Ask why Nika imagery was seeded back in Skypiea. Don't just scream Sanji royalty twist. Remember how Mr. Prince, the bounty weirdness, and the North Blue origin were built brick by brick. We need to read One Piece the way it's written, as a planned, documented endgame, not a miracle accident. So here's your homework. Share this with that one friend who still insists Zoro is Ryuma reincarnated and refuses to read the SBS about Shimotsuki Kozaburo. Drop your wildest remaining Zoro theories in the comments, but tag which category you think they're in. Genuine foreshadowing, clever retrofit, or pure headcanon copium. And maybe go rewatch a few East Blue episodes with the Shimotsuki lens on and see what suddenly feels intentional. If spending an embarrassing chunk of my adult life on this breakdown means even 3 of you stop chanting Oda planned everything from chapter 1 and start asking how he planned it, it was worth it. This is fine. This is normal. Now go touch grass, then come back and overanalyze something else with me.